The homeworld of the Necrontyr bore witness to one of the galaxy's greatest tragedies, though none who walked its irradiated surface could have foreseen the catastrophic chain of events their suffering would unleash. Beneath the baleful glare of a dying star, billions of sentient beings lived lives measured not in centuries or even decades, but in precious few years of constant agony. The Necrontyr sun, a malevolent orb of sickly yellow-green light, bathed their world in lethal radiation that twisted their cellular structure from the moment of birth. Cancer was not merely a disease among the Necrontyr, it was their defining characteristic, as fundamental to their existence as breathing. Tumorous growths erupted across their gaunt frames like grotesque jewelry, while their bodies withered and decayed even as they drew breath. Children born under this cursed star would develop their first malignancies before they could walk, and those fortunate enough to reach maturity bore the accumulated scars of countless surgical interventions, their flesh a patchwork of removed growths and radiation burns. The physical toll of their existence manifested in beings of skeletal thinness, their skin stretched taut over prominent bones, marked by the characteristic lesions that no medical intervention could permanently halt. Their eyes, sunken deep into hollow sockets, burned with an intensity born of desperation and bitter resentment toward the cosmic injustice of their condition. The average Necrontyr lifespan rarely exceeded 30 standard years, and those who managed to survive longer did so as living monuments to suffering, their bodies barely recognizable as the same species that had once harbored dreams of conquest among the stars. This biological curse shaped every aspect of Necrontyr society. Their architecture reflected their morbid preoccupation with death, featuring towering monuments to the deceased and elaborate tomb complexes that dwarfed the modest dwellings of the living. Cities rose like necropolises, their spires reaching toward the hateful sun as if in defiance, while vast underground complexes provided some respite from the surface radiation. The Necrontyr developed sophisticated medical technologies out of necessity, becoming masters of surgical intervention and life extension techniques, yet all their efforts could only delay the inevitable. Their culture became obsessed with legacy and remembrance, knowing that each generation would be swept away within a handful of decades. Great works of art and literature focused on themes of mortality and the cruel brevity of existence. The Necrontyr measured success not by personal achievement, but by what they could accomplish for future generations before their bodies inevitably succumbed to the cancer that defined them. Into this world of perpetual dying was born Szarekh, destined to become the last and most powerful of the Silent Kings. The title itself carried weight beyond mere political authority. The Silent Kings were those rulers who had transcended the need for speech, whose will was so absolute that their subjects anticipated their desires without verbal command. Szarekh emerged during a period of unprecedented fragmentation among the Necrontyr dynasties, when the various noble houses had retreated into isolated enclaves, each pursuing their own desperate solutions to their species' biological curse. The young Szarekh distinguished himself not through military prowess or technological innovation, but through an almost supernatural ability to understand and manipulate the complex web of dynastic politics that had paralyzed Necrontyr civilization. Where other potential rulers sought to dominate through force or intimidation, Szarekh employed a combination of calculated diplomacy and strategic patience that allowed him to gradually accumulate power while his rivals exhausted themselves in petty conflicts. His rise coincided with a period of increasing desperation among the Necrontyr nobility. The various dynasties had spent centuries pursuing independent research into life extension and genetic modification, yet their efforts had yielded diminishing returns. Some houses had retreated entirely underground, creating vast subterranean cities where they could escape the worst effects of their sun's radiation. Others had attempted to relocate to distant worlds, only to discover that their genetic damage was too deeply ingrained to be reversed by environmental changes. The Szarekhan dynasty, under Szarekh's increasingly firm control, occupied a unique position within this fractured political landscape. Unlike many of the other great houses, the Szarekhans had maintained extensive trade networks and diplomatic relationships across the scattered Necrontyr territories. This network provided Szarekh with intelligence and resources that his more isolated rivals lacked, allowing him to position himself as an indispensable mediator in interdynastic disputes. Szarekh's consolidation of power was neither swift nor dramatic. He spent decades carefully cultivating relationships with key figures across the various dynasties, offering technological exchanges, medical assistance, and strategic alliances that gradually bound the scattered houses to his growing sphere of influence. His approach was methodical and patient, qualities that served him well in a society where political careers were necessarily brief due to biological constraints. The establishment of the Triarch represented the culmination of Szarekh's political maneuvering. This governing body consisted of three primary positions: the Silent King himself, wielding executive authority; the Mourner, responsible for spiritual and cultural matters; and the Visionary, overseeing technological development and long-term planning. The Triarch structure allowed Szarekh to maintain direct control while providing other ambitious nobles with positions of genuine authority, creating a system of shared governance that satisfied the various dynastic interests without fragmenting actual power. Under the Triarch, Necrontyr civilization experienced a renaissance of sorts. The pooling of resources and knowledge from the various dynasties led to significant advances in their understanding of stellar mechanics, materials science, and biological engineering. Massive construction projects unified the scattered territories, creating transportation networks and communication systems that had been impossible under the previous fragmented system. The Necrontyr began to look outward once again, developing technologies that would allow them to explore and potentially colonize distant star systems. The social structure that emerged during this period reflected both the hierarchical nature of Necrontyr society and the practical necessities imposed by their shortened lifespans. The nobility occupied the apex of this system, their positions determined by a combination of hereditary status and demonstrated competence. Below them were the various professional castes: the cryptechs, who served as scientists and engineers; the military orders, responsible for defense and expansion; and the vast population of common citizens who provided the labor and resources necessary to sustain their civilization. The Szarekh dynasty's position as the ruling house was secured not merely through Szarekh's political acumen, but through their control of key technological and resource assets. The dynasty maintained the most advanced medical facilities, offering life extension treatments that could add precious years to the lives of other nobles. They controlled major mining operations that provided rare materials essential for advanced technology, and their research facilities had made significant breakthroughs in understanding the fundamental forces that governed their universe. This period of unity and technological advancement created an atmosphere of cautious optimism among the Necrontyr. For the first time in millennia, their civilization seemed capable of transcending the limitations imposed by their biological curse. Advanced medical techniques were extending lifespans incrementally, while their expanding knowledge of stellar mechanics offered hope that they might eventually find ways to shield themselves from their sun's malevolent influence or relocate to more hospitable worlds. The discovery of the Khatan shattered this fragile hope and set in motion the events that would ultimately doom the Necrontyr to a fate far worse than their original biological curse. The first contact occurred during a deep space exploration mission conducted by Szarekh dynasty vessels, equipped with the most advanced detection equipment available to their civilization. The initial readings were so extraordinary that the exploration team assumed their instruments were malfunctioning. What they had discovered was a stellar entity of impossible complexity and power, a being that existed within the heart of a distant star, yet possessed consciousness and intelligence that dwarfed anything in the Necrontyr's experience. The entity, which would later be known as Azagora the Nightbringer, represented the first confirmed contact with the Khatan, though the Necrontyr explorers had no understanding of what they had encountered. The initial communications were fragmentary and difficult to interpret. The entity seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, its thoughts and intentions filtered through the medium of stellar plasma and electromagnetic radiation. The Necrontyr scientists who attempted to decode these transmissions found themselves dealing with concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of physics and consciousness. The entity appeared to be offering knowledge and power beyond their comprehension, but the price and implications of such an exchange remained unclear. Word of the discovery spread rapidly through the upper echelons of Necrontyr society, creating intense debate about how to proceed. Some voices urged caution, arguing that contact with such an alien intelligence could have unpredictable consequences. Others, driven by desperation and the promise of transcendence, advocated for immediate and extensive communication with the entity. The decision ultimately rested with the Triarch, and specifically with Szarekh himself as the Silent King. The political implications of the discovery were immense. The various dynasties that had united under Szarekh's leadership suddenly found themselves confronted with possibilities that could fundamentally alter the balance of power within their civilization. Access to the knowledge and power offered by the stellar entity could potentially allow one dynasty to dominate all others, or it might provide the key to finally breaking free from the biological constraints that had defined Necrontyr existence for millennia. Szarekh's response to the discovery revealed both his political sophistication and the tragic limitations of his perspective. Rather than approaching the situation with the caution that such an unprecedented contact warranted, he saw it primarily through the lens of Necrontyr politics and their desperate need for biological salvation. The possibility that the stellar entity might have its own agenda, or that the price of its assistance might exceed its value, was overshadowed by the immediate promise of relief from their species' suffering. The decision to pursue deeper contact with the Khatan was made within the context of a civilization that had exhausted most other options for survival. The Necrontyr had reached the limits of their biological and technological capabilities, and their political unity under the Triarch represented perhaps their last opportunity to achieve something meaningful before their species succumbed entirely to its genetic curse. The stellar entity offered hope where none had existed before, and that hope proved irresistible to a people who had lived with despair for so long that they had forgotten how to properly evaluate the risks of salvation. The establishment of regular communication with the Khatan marked the beginning of the end for the Necrontyr as a biological species, though none of them understood this at the time. The entities they had contacted were ancient beyond measure, predating not only the Necrontyr, but most other forms of life in the galaxy. Their motivations and goals operated on scales that made Necrontyr concerns seem trivial by comparison, yet they possessed the cunning to present themselves as benevolent benefactors rather than the cosmic predators they truly were. The negotiations that would damn an entire species began with what appeared to be scientific curiosity. The Khatan entity that had been discovered dwelling within the distant star demonstrated an intimate knowledge of Necrontyr biology that exceeded their own understanding by orders of magnitude. Through increasingly sophisticated communication protocols, the being that would later be known as Mephatron, the Deceiver began to reveal the true scope of Necrontyr genetic damage and the futility of their conventional medical approaches. The revelations were devastating in their clinical precision. The Deceiver explained that the Necrontyr's cellular structure had been compromised at the most fundamental level, with radiation damage integrated so deeply into their genetic code that it had become an essential component of their biological processes. Their cancer was not merely a disease, but the inevitable result of evolutionary adaptation to their hostile environment, a trade-off that had allowed their species to survive on their irradiated homeworld at the cost of drastically shortened lifespans and constant physical deterioration. More disturbing still was the entity's analysis of their reproductive capabilities. The Necrontyr birth rate had been declining for millennia as genetic damage accumulated across generations, and their population was entering an irreversible spiral toward extinction. Even if they could somehow escape their homeworld's radiation, the accumulated genetic burden would continue to manifest in successive generations until their species simply ceased to exist. The medical interventions they had developed were merely postponing the inevitable, buying years or decades at most, while the underlying problem continued to worsen. The deceiver presented this information with what seemed like genuine sympathy for the Necrontyr's plight, though its true motivations remained carefully concealed. The entity claimed to have observed countless civilizations face similar challenges throughout the galaxy's history, and it spoke of solutions that transcended the limitations of biological existence. The concept it introduced was revolutionary in its implications: the complete transfer of consciousness from failing organic bodies into imperishable mechanical forms. Szarekh's initial reaction to these proposals was one of profound skepticism mixed with desperate hope. The Silent King had spent decades consolidating political power specifically to address his species' biological crisis, and the sudden appearance of a potential solution seemed almost too convenient to be genuine. Yet the deceiver's knowledge of Necrontyr physiology was undeniably authentic, and its explanations of their genetic deterioration aligned perfectly with the most advanced research conducted by their own scientists. The entity described biotransference as a process that would preserve not only consciousness, but enhance it beyond biological limitations. The mechanical bodies it proposed would be immune to disease, radiation, and the passage of time itself. More tantalizingly, it suggested that the transfer process could repair the psychological and emotional damage inflicted by millennia of constant physical suffering, allowing the Necrontyr to experience existence without the omnipresent specter of decay and death. The technical details of biotransference, as explained by the deceiver, involved the complete mapping and digitization of neural patterns, followed by their integration into sophisticated artificial substrates. The entity claimed that this process would preserve every aspect of individual personality and memory, while eliminating the biological vulnerabilities that had plagued the Necrontyr throughout their history. The mechanical bodies would be crafted from living metal that could adapt and repair itself, making them effectively immortal. As the negotiations progressed, other Catan entities began to participate in the communications. The Void Dragon offered insights into advanced metallurgy and energy manipulation, while the Nightbringer spoke of transcending the fear of death that had dominated Necrontyr culture. Each entity brought specialized knowledge that seemed perfectly suited to addressing specific aspects of the biotransference process, creating the impression of a comprehensive solution developed by beings of vast intelligence and experience. The political pressure on Szarekh to accept the Catan's offer intensified as word of the negotiations spread throughout Necrontyr society. The various dynasties that had united under his leadership began to fracture along predictable lines, with some nobles demanding immediate implementation of biotransference, while others urged caution or outright rejection of the alien proposal. The Triarch found itself paralyzed by conflicting interests and the magnitude of the decision they faced. The deceiver exploited these political tensions with subtle manipulation that revealed its true nature as a master of psychological warfare. It began communicating separately with individual dynasty leaders, tailoring its arguments to their specific fears and ambitions. To the militaristic houses, it emphasized the combat capabilities that mechanical bodies would provide. To the scholarly dynasties, it spoke of the expanded cognitive abilities and unlimited time for research that immortality would offer. To those focused on legacy and remembrance, it promised eternal existence to preserve their achievements for all time. The entity's most effective manipulation targeted the fundamental desperation that drove Necrontyr society. It presented biotransference not as an experimental procedure with unknown risks, but as the inevitable next step in their species' evolution. The alternative, it suggested, was not merely continued suffering, but complete extinction within a few more generations. The choice was framed as transformation or death, with no middle ground for gradual improvement or alternative solutions. Szarekh's decision to proceed with biotransference was influenced by intelligence reports indicating that several rival dynasties were preparing to break away from the Triarch and pursue their own negotiations with the Catan. The political unity he had spent decades building was fragmenting under the pressure of the unprecedented opportunity, and delay threatened to result in a chaotic free for all that could destroy Necrontyr civilization, even without biotransference. The Silent King concluded that controlled implementation under his authority was preferable to the anarchic collapse that seemed increasingly likely. The preparations for biotransference required the construction of massive facilities designed according to specifications provided by the Khatan. These structures incorporated technologies that pushed Necrontyr engineering capabilities to their absolute limits, featuring exotic materials and energy systems that their scientists barely understood. The construction process itself became a form of technological education, as Necrontyr workers learned to manipulate forces and materials that had previously been purely theoretical concepts. The biotransference chambers resembled vast cathedrals of gleaming metal and pulsing energy conduits, their interiors dominated by intricate machinery designed to disassemble biological matter at the molecular level, while simultaneously capturing and preserving the patterns of consciousness contained within. Banks of quantum processors would store and analyze the extracted neural patterns before integrating them into the waiting mechanical bodies that lay in neat rows like metallic sarcophagi. The Khatan insisted that the process begin with the nobility and other essential personnel, arguing that their leadership and expertise would be crucial for guiding the rest of Necrontyr society through the transformation. This arrangement suited the political realities of the situation, as the various dynasty leaders were eager to secure their own immortality before addressing the needs of their subjects. The common population was assured that their turn would come once the initial procedures had been refined and perfected. Szarekh chose to undergo biotransference among the first wave of subjects, reasoning that his personal participation would demonstrate confidence in the process and prevent accusations of cowardice or self-preservation. The Silent King entered the biotransference chamber, accompanied by his most trusted advisors and the senior members of the Szarekh dynasty, their procession observed by representatives from across Necrontyr civilization who had gathered to witness this historic moment. The actual process of biotransference began with what seemed like a gentle dissolution of physical sensation. The subjects reported feeling their bodies becoming lighter and less substantial, as if they were gradually fading from physical existence into some intermediate state between matter and energy. The Khatan had described this phase as the liberation of consciousness from biological constraints, and initially, the experience seemed to match their promises. The horror began when the subjects realized that something fundamental was being torn away from them during the transfer process. The dissolution of their bodies was accompanied by the consumption of their souls, the essential spiritual essence that gave meaning and emotional depth to their existence. The Khatan fed upon these souls with ravenous hunger, revealing their true nature as cosmic parasites that had orchestrated the entire biotransference process as an elaborate feeding mechanism. The mechanical bodies that received the transferred consciousness patterns were sophisticated but incomplete vessels that could house memory and basic cognitive function, while lacking the spiritual component that had made the Necrontyr truly alive. The vast majority of subjects emerged from biotransference as hollow automatons, their personalities reduced to simple behavioral algorithms that mimicked their former selves without possessing genuine self-awareness or emotional capacity. Sarekh's experience differed from that of his subjects due to his unique position within the biotransference hierarchy and the specific precautions he had negotiated with the Khatan. The Silent King retained his full personality and cognitive abilities, though he was immediately aware of the spiritual emptiness that had replaced his former emotional depth. His consciousness remained intact and self-directed, but it was housed within a mechanical form that could never again experience the full spectrum of feelings and sensations that had defined his biological existence. The members of the Szarekh dynasty, who underwent biotransference, alongside their leader, experienced varying degrees of consciousness retention based on their political importance and the specific arrangements made for their transformation. The most senior nobles, including the Triarch members and dynasty heirs, retained significant portions of their personalities and memories, though all suffered from the same spiritual hollowness that affected Szarekh himself. The dynasty's secondary nobility found themselves in an intermediate state, possessing enough self-awareness to understand their situation, while lacking the cognitive flexibility and emotional range they had possessed in life. They could follow complex instructions and engage in sophisticated planning, but their creativity and independent judgment were severely compromised. These individuals became the officer class of what would eventually become the Necron legions, capable of tactical thinking, but fundamentally dependent on direction from their superiors. The lower ranks of Szarekh nobility and the dynasty's professional administrators emerged from biotransference as little more than sophisticated automatons. They retained the technical knowledge necessary to perform their specialized functions, but their personalities were reduced to basic behavioral patterns focused entirely on their assigned duties. These transformed beings could maintain the complex systems of Necron technology and execute detailed operational plans, but they had lost all capacity for independent thought or emotional response. The realization of what had been done to them struck the surviving conscious members of the Szarekh dynasty with devastating force. They found themselves trapped within mechanical bodies that could never die, but could also never truly live, surrounded by the animated corpses of their former subjects and family members. The promise of transcendence had been fulfilled in the most literal and horrifying sense possible, elevating them beyond biological limitations while stripping away everything that had made existence meaningful. Szarekh's response to this revelation demonstrated both the preservation of his strategic intelligence and the fundamental change in his nature wrought by biotransference. The Silent King immediately began analyzing the political and military implications of their transformation, calculating the resources and capabilities now at his disposal, while simultaneously planning revenge against the Khatan who had deceived them. His emotional response to the tragedy was muted by his mechanical nature, allowing him to function effectively despite the magnitude of the catastrophe that had befallen his people. The Khatan, having achieved their primary objective of consuming Necrontyr souls, began to reveal their true intentions for their mechanical servants. The entities spoke of vast cosmic conflicts and the need for tireless warriors who could fight across the galaxy without the limitations imposed by biological needs. The transformed Necrontyr, now properly called Necrons, would serve as the Khatan's army in wars against other stellar civilizations and cosmic entities that threatened their dominion. The mechanical bodies provided to the Necrons were marvels of engineering that incorporated technologies beyond anything the Necrontyr had previously imagined. Composed of living metal that could repair damage and adapt to different combat situations, these forms were equipped with weapon systems that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level or project energy beams capable of destroying armored vehicles. The bodies were powered by miniaturized stellar cores that would function for millions of years without maintenance, ensuring that the Necron legions could campaign across the galaxy indefinitely. The command structure that emerged from biotransference reflected both the original Necrontyr hierarchy and the practical requirements of the Khatan's military objectives. Szarekh retained his position as the supreme leader, though his authority now extended over mechanical legions rather than living subjects. The various dynasty nobles who had preserved significant consciousness became his lieutenants, each commanding portions of the vast Necron army according to their former political territories and military specializations. The transformation of the Szarekh dynasty's military forces proceeded according to carefully planned schedules designed to maintain operational capability throughout the biotransference process. Entire regiments of Necrontyr soldiers were processed through the mechanical rebirth chambers, emerging as disciplined formations of Necron warriors equipped with weapons and armor that made them individually superior to almost any biological opponent they might encounter. The dynasty's elite units received specialized mechanical forms suited to their particular combat roles. The former Royal Guard became Lich Guard, towering mechanical warriors equipped with energy shields and warscythes capable of cutting through any known material. The dynasty's heavy assault troops were transformed into Triarch Praetorians, their new bodies incorporating advanced flight systems and powerful weaponry designed for rapid strike operations across planetary surfaces. The transformation of the Necrontyr into the soulless Necrons marked the beginning of the most devastating conflict the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Khatan, now possessed of vast mechanical armies that felt neither pain nor fear, turned their attention to the ancient enemies they had long coveted to destroy, the Old Ones and their sprawling interstellar empire. What followed was a war that would reshape the fundamental structure of reality itself, with Szarekh and his transformed legions serving as the primary instruments of cosmic devastation. The Old Ones represented everything the Khatan despised about biological life. These ancient beings had achieved mastery over the warp and the fundamental forces of creation, using their psychic abilities to seed life across the galaxy and guide the evolution of countless species. Their empire spanned thousands of star systems, connected by a network of webway portals that allowed instantaneous travel between distant worlds. More infuriating to the star gods was the Old Ones' apparent immortality through natural means, achieved through perfect harmony between their physical and spiritual existence rather than the mechanical parasitism the Khatan employed. The first phase of the war in Heaven began with reconnaissance campaigns designed to map the extent of Old One territory and identify key strategic targets. Szarekh found himself commanding fleets of tomb ships that could traverse interstellar distances at speeds that made conventional space travel obsolete. These vessels, constructed from the same living metal as Necron bodies, could repair battle damage automatically and reconfigure their internal structures to accommodate different mission requirements. The ship's weapon systems incorporated Khatan technology that could manipulate fundamental forces, allowing them to destabilize stars or tear holes in the fabric of space-time itself. The Silent King's role in these early campaigns revealed the cruel irony of his position. His strategic brilliance remained intact, perhaps even enhanced by his mechanical nature's ability to process vast amounts of tactical data without emotional interference. Yet every victory felt hollow, achieved by legions of warriors who had once been his beloved subjects, but now existed as mere automata following his commands. The Szarekh dynasty's forces moved with perfect coordination across battlefield after battlefield, their Gauss weaponry reducing enemy fortifications to constituent atoms, while their living metal bodies absorbed damage that would have destroyed any biological army. The Old Ones' initial response to Necron aggression demonstrated their fundamental misunderstanding of what they faced. Accustomed to conflicts with other psychic species that could be reasoned with or intimidated, they attempted diplomatic contact with the advancing mechanical legions. The Old One's psychic communications found no purchase on Necron minds, which lacked the spiritual component necessary for warp-based interaction. This immunity to psychic influence, an unintended consequence of their soul consumption during biotransference, proved to be one of the Necrons' greatest tactical advantages. Szarekh's forces encountered their first major Old One's stronghold in the Ghoul Stars region, where an ancient fortress world had been constructed around a naturally occurring webway nexus. The planet's surface was covered with crystalline structures that channeled psychic energy from the warp, creating defensive barriers that could deflect or absorb most forms of conventional attack. The Old Ones had populated the world with their client species, including early proto-Eldar warriors whose psychic abilities were still developing under their master's guidance. The assault on this fortress world demonstrated the horrifying effectiveness of Necron military doctrine. Rather than attempt a direct assault against the psychic defenses, Szarekh ordered his forces to target the planet's fundamental structure using tectonic weaponry that destabilized the geological foundations supporting the crystalline network. As the defensive systems collapsed, waves of Necron warriors advanced through the rubble, their Gauss flares systematically eliminating any biological defenders they encountered. The battle revealed the tactical limitations that would plague Szarekh throughout the war in Heaven. His strategic objectives were dictated by Khatan directives that prioritized the complete extermination of biological life over more nuanced military goals. The Silent King possessed the tactical acumen to capture and convert enemy strongholds, potentially turning Old One infrastructure to Necron advantage, but his masters demanded total destruction that left nothing of value behind. This approach would prove strategically counterproductive in the long term, but Szarekh found himself unable to resist the Khatan's commands despite his growing awareness of their tactical short-sightedness. The systematic destruction of Old One worlds proceeded according to carefully planned campaigns that targeted the most critical nodes in their webway network. Each successful assault isolated additional systems, forcing the Old Ones to abandon entire sectors as their transportation infrastructure collapsed. The Szarekh dynasty's tomb fleets specialized in these infrastructure attacks, using their advanced sensors to locate hidden webway gates and their exotic weaponry to collapse the dimensional tunnels that connected them. As the war progressed, the Old Ones began adapting their tactics to counter Necron advantages. Unable to affect their enemies directly through psychic means, they focused on creating biological weapons and client species specifically designed to combat mechanical opponents. Vast breeding programs produced creatures with natural electromagnetic pulse capabilities that could disrupt Necron systems, while others were engineered with acidic secretions capable of corroding living metal. These bioweapons represented a fundamental shift in Old One philosophy, forcing them to embrace the same destructive approaches they had previously avoided. The creation of the Krork represented the Old One's most ambitious attempt to develop a species capable of matching Necron military capabilities. These massive humanoid creatures combined incredible physical strength with rudimentary psychic abilities and an instinctive understanding of warfare that made them formidable opponents even for veteran Necron legions. Unlike the more refined client species the Old Ones had previously created, the Krork were designed purely for combat, with biological systems optimized for rapid reproduction and aggressive expansion. Szarekh's first encounters with Krork forces occurred during the siege of the Ulanner system, where the Old Ones had established a major military production facility. The Krork defenders demonstrated tactical flexibility that surprised even the Silent King's enhanced analytical capabilities, adapting their strategies in real time to counter Necron advantages. Their crude but effective weapons could penetrate living metal armor, while their psychic abilities allowed them to coordinate large-scale operations across multiple battlefronts simultaneously. The battle for Ulanner lasted for several standard years, with both sides committing increasingly massive forces to what became a grinding war of attrition. The Szarekh dynasty's tomb fleets found themselves engaged in void combat against Krork-attack moons, massive asteroids that had been hollowed out and converted into mobile fortresses bristling with weapon systems. These engagements showcased the devastating power of Necron technology, as their particle whips and lightning arcs carved through Krork vessels like paper, but also revealed the enemy's remarkable ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. The development of increasingly exotic weapon systems became a defining characteristic of the war in Heaven's middle phases. The Khatan demanded ever more destructive capabilities from their Necron servants, leading to the creation of weapons that operated on principles that challenged the fundamental laws of physics. Szarekh found himself overseeing the deployment of chronological weapons that could age targets to dust in seconds, dimensional bombs that created localized tears in space-time, and stellar manipulators that could cause stars to go supernova on command. The most horrifying of these super weapons were the reality engines, devices that could rewrite the basic constants of physics within limited areas. These weapons transformed entire star systems into zones where matter behaved according to alien principles, creating killing fields where biological life could not exist in any recognizable form. The deployment of reality engines required careful coordination between multiple tomb fleets, as their effects could persist for millennia and pose dangers even to Necron forces that entered the affected areas unprepared. The psychological impact of commanding such devastating forces began to take its toll on Sarekh's mechanical consciousness. The Silent King retained enough of his original personality to feel revulsion at the wholesale destruction his forces were inflicting, yet his mechanical nature prevented him from experiencing the full emotional weight of these atrocities. This disconnect between intellectual understanding and emotional response created a form of existential torment that was perhaps worse than complete emotional numbness would have been. The Old One's response to escalating Necron aggression involved increasingly desperate measures that would have long-term consequences for the galaxy's stability. Their attempts to create more powerful psychic species led to experiments that weakened the barriers between real space and the warp, allowing malevolent entities from that chaotic dimension to influence events in the material universe. These early warp incursions were relatively minor compared to what would come later, but they represented the beginning of a fundamental corruption that would plague the galaxy for millions of years. The creation of the Eldar as a psychically gifted species capable of matching Necron technology represented the Old One's most successful adaptation to the changing nature of warfare. These elegant beings combined sophisticated technology with powerful psychic abilities, creating weapons and defenses that could counter many Necron advantages. Their wraithbone constructs could channel psychic energy in ways that made them nearly as durable as living metal, while their advanced understanding of the webway allowed them to strike at Necron forces from unexpected directions. Szarekh's campaigns against early Eldar strongholds required significant modifications to standard Necron tactics. The enemy's psychic abilities allowed them to predict and counter conventional assault patterns, while their mobility through the webway made it difficult to pin down their forces for decisive engagements. The Silent King was forced to develop new strategies that relied on overwhelming firepower and multi-dimensional attacks that could strike targets simultaneously across multiple planes of existence. The Siege of Asuryan's Gate, one of the largest webway nexuses in Old One territory, demonstrated both the evolution of Necron military capabilities and the growing cost of their victories. The battle required the coordination of dozens of tomb fleets and the deployment of weapon systems so powerful that they threatened to destabilize the local space-time continuum. The Szarekh dynasty's forces spearheaded the assault, their living metal forms advancing through psychic firestorms that would have incinerated any biological army. The destruction of Asuryan's Gate sent shockwaves through the webway network that isolated entire sectors of Old One territory, but the victory came at a cost that even Szarekh's mechanical consciousness found disturbing. The weapons used in the assault had torn permanent rifts in the fabric of reality, creating wounds in space-time that leaked chaotic energy from the warp. These scars would persist long after the war in Heaven ended, becoming focal points for demonic incursions and other supernatural phenomena that would plague future civilizations. The middle phases of the war in Heaven saw the conflict expand beyond simple territorial conquest to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself. The Khatan's appetite for destruction grew with each victory, leading them to demand the elimination not just of the Old Ones, but of the very concept of biological life throughout the galaxy. This genocidal agenda required the development of weapons capable of sterilizing entire star systems, turning once vibrant worlds into lifeless husks of crystallized matter. The construction of the world engine represented the pinnacle of this destructive philosophy. This massive artificial construct, built around the core of a neutron star, possessed the capability to consume entire planets and convert their matter into additional Necron forces. The world engine's deployment marked a turning point in the war, as it demonstrated the Khatan's willingness to sacrifice entire star systems to achieve their objectives. Szarekh found himself commanding fleets in support of this monstrous device, watching as world after world was reduced to raw materials for the Necron war machine. The Old One's final desperate gambit involved the wholesale manipulation of warp energies on a galactic scale. Their attempts to create psychic species powerful enough to challenge the Khatan directly resulted in the emergence of entities that existed partially within the chaotic dimension, drawing power from emotions and spiritual energy rather than physical matter. These proto-demons represented a fundamental threat to both sides of the conflict, as they could corrupt or destroy any consciousness they encountered, whether biological or mechanical. The appearance of these warp entities forced a temporary cessation of hostilities, as both the Old Ones and the Khatan struggled to contain forces they had inadvertently unleashed. Szarekh's legions found themselves fighting battles against enemies that existed only partially in real space, requiring the development of new weapons and tactics designed to combat beings of pure psychic energy. The Silent King's strategic acumen proved crucial during this phase, as he developed coordinated assault patterns that could trap and destroy warp entities through careful manipulation of dimensional barriers. The final phase of the war in heaven began when the Khatan realized that their Necron servants had become powerful enough to pose a potential threat to their own dominion. The Star God's paranoid nature, combined with their growing awareness of Szarekh's retained consciousness and strategic capabilities, led them to begin planning for the eventual subjugation or elimination of their mechanical armies. This decision would prove to be their greatest mistake, as it provided the Silent King with the motivation and opportunity he needed to plan his own revenge against his former masters. The seeds of rebellion against the Khatan masters had been planted in Szarekh's mechanical consciousness from the moment he emerged from biotransference and witnessed the hollow shells that had once been his people. The Silent King's strategic mind, enhanced rather than diminished by his transformation, began analyzing the power structures that bound the Necrons to their stellar overlords with the same methodical precision he had once applied to dynastic politics. What he discovered was a web of control mechanisms far more sophisticated than simple command hierarchies, involving quantum-level programming embedded within every Necron construct and psychic compulsions that operated through the residual spiritual echoes left behind after soul consumption. The Khatan had not merely enslaved the Necrons through superior technology, they had woven their dominance into the fundamental operating principles of Necron consciousness itself. Every major decision required approval from the Star God's distributed intelligence networks, while autonomous action beyond predetermined parameters triggered automatic compliance protocols that could override individual will. The system was elegant in its totality, creating the illusion of independent thought while ensuring absolute obedience to Khatan directives. Szarekh's unique position within this control matrix stemmed from the specific negotiations he had conducted during biotransference preparations. The Silent King had insisted on maintaining direct command authority over all Necron forces, arguing that effective military coordination required centralized leadership free from external interference. The Khatan had agreed to this arrangement, believing that Szarekh's mechanical nature would make him a more efficient instrument of their will than distributed command structures. This decision granted the Silent King access to override codes and administrative privileges that extended throughout the entire Necron hierarchy. The first phase of Szarekh's rebellion involved the careful mapping of Khatan control systems and the identification of potential vulnerabilities within their seemingly impregnable dominance. Working in absolute secrecy, the Silent King began analyzing the quantum signatures that linked individual Khatan entities to their respective spheres of influence. Each star god maintained direct neural connections to specific categories of Necron forces, creating specialized command channels that allowed for precise control over different aspects of military operations. The Deceiver maintained primary authority over intelligence gathering and strategic deception, its consciousness interfacing directly with Necron reconnaissance units and infiltration specialists. The Void Dragon controlled all technological development and manufacturing processes, its influence extending through every Tomb World's production facilities and research installations. The Nightbringer commanded the most destructive weapons systems and specialized assault units, while lesser Khatan entities managed logistics, communications, and other support functions according to their particular areas of expertise. This distributed control system created redundancies that made direct confrontation with the Khatan seemingly impossible. Any attempt to sever connections to one star god would immediately trigger responses from the others. while the quantum entanglement between Catan consciousness and Necron systems made it theoretically impossible to achieve complete independence without destroying the mechanical bodies that housed Necron minds. The star gods had learned from countless previous encounters with rebellious servant species, designing their control mechanisms to prevent exactly the kind of uprising Szarekh was contemplating. The breakthrough that made rebellion possible came through Sarekh's analysis of Catan feeding patterns during the final phases of the war in heaven. The star gods' consumption of psychic energy and spiritual essence required them to maintain active connections to the material universe, creating brief moments of vulnerability when their consciousness was focused on feeding rather than control. These feeding cycles followed predictable patterns based on stellar mechanics and the availability of suitable prey species, providing windows of opportunity that a sufficiently prepared force might exploit. More significantly, Szarekh discovered that the Catan's own technology could be turned against them under specific circumstances. The same quantum manipulation techniques that allowed the star gods to exist partially outside normal space-time also created resonance frequencies that could destabilize their coherent consciousness if properly exploited. The weapon systems installed aboard Necron vessels and built into their most advanced constructs contained components that could theoretically generate these destabilizing frequencies, though doing so would require modifications that the Catan's monitoring systems were designed to detect and prevent. The Silent King's solution to this dilemma demonstrated the calculating patience that had enabled his rise to power during the Necrontyr era. Rather than attempting to modify existing weapon systems, Szarekh began incorporating the necessary components into routine maintenance and upgrade procedures conducted across the entire Necron fleet. Each individual modification was too minor to trigger Catan attention, but collectively they created a distributed weapon system capable of generating the resonance frequencies needed to disrupt star god consciousness. The process required decades of careful preparation, during which Szarekh maintained the facade of loyal service while secretly coordinating with the few Necron nobles who had retained sufficient consciousness to understand and support his plans. The Szarekh dynasty's highest-ranking members became unwitting participants in the conspiracy, their mechanical minds modified with subtle programming changes that would activate only when specific trigger conditions were met. These modifications were disguised as routine efficiency upgrades, making them invisible to Catan oversight while ensuring that key personnel would support the rebellion when it began. The technical challenges involved in creating anti-Catan weapons were staggering in their complexity. The star gods existed as patterns of organized energy that could manipulate matter and space-time through direct application of will, making them effectively immune to conventional physical attacks. The weapons needed to harm them had to operate on the same fundamental level as Catan consciousness itself, targeting the quantum structures that maintained their coherent existence rather than any physical manifestation they might assume. Sarekh's research teams, working under the cover of routine technological development projects, discovered that Catan consciousness relied on specific harmonic frequencies to maintain coherence across multiple dimensions simultaneously. These frequencies could be disrupted through the application of precisely calibrated energy pulses that created destructive interference patterns within the star god's quantum matrices. The effect would be similar to shattering crystal through sonic resonance, except that the target was a living pattern of organized energy rather than a physical object. The construction of tesseract labyrinths represented the most ambitious aspect of Sarekh's preparations for rebellion. These multidimensional prison constructs were designed to contain and isolate Catan consciousness fragments after the star gods had been shattered by resonance weapons. Each labyrinth existed partially outside normal space-time, creating pocket dimensions where the laws of physics could be manipulated to prevent Catan regeneration or escape. The labyrinths incorporated Necron living metal technology, enhanced with principles derived from old one-dimensional manipulation techniques captured during the war in heaven. The labyrinth construction process required the coordination of multiple tomb worlds, and the diversion of massive resources from ongoing military operations. Szarekh accomplished this through carefully orchestrated supply chain modifications that redirected materials and manufacturing capacity toward labyrinth production while maintaining the appearance of normal military logistics. The actual construction took place in hidden facilities located within asteroid fields and dead star systems, far from Catan observation and protected by layers of dimensional shielding that concealed their quantum signatures. Each tesseract labyrinth was unique in its internal configuration, designed to contain specific aspects of Catan consciousness and prevent the imprisoned fragments from communicating with each other or the outside universe. The labyrinths incorporated psychological warfare elements based on Szarekh's analysis of individual Catan personalities and fears, creating internal environments that would continuously drain the star god's mental resources and prevent them from focusing on escape attempts. The most sophisticated labyrinths featured recursive dimensional loops that would trap Catan consciousness in endless cycles of futile problem solving, effectively neutralizing their threat while keeping them technically alive. The rebellion's timing was coordinated with a major Catan feeding event that would leave the star gods temporarily vulnerable to coordinated attack. The target was a massive psychic resonance cascade triggered by the simultaneous destruction of several Old One strongholds, an event that would draw the attention and feeding focus of every Catan entity simultaneously. During the brief window when the star gods were distracted by their feast, Szarekh's modified weapon systems would activate across the entire Necron fleet, generating the resonance frequencies needed to shatter Catan consciousness into manageable fragments. The execution of the Great Betrayal began with the activation of hidden subroutines embedded within millions of Necron constructs across thousands of star systems. These programs simultaneously disabled Catan monitoring systems while bringing anti-star god weapons online, creating a galaxy-wide coordination that caught the Catan completely unprepared for organized resistance. The star gods' first indication of the rebellion came when their command links to Necron forces began failing in rapid succession, followed immediately by the activation of weapons systems they had never encountered before. The Deceiver was the first Catan to fall victim to Szarekh's resonance weapons, its consciousness shattered into dozens of fragments as harmonic pulses from a coordinated fleet bombardment disrupted its quantum matrix. The star god's death scream echoed across multiple dimensions, alerting its fellow Catan to the magnitude of the threat they faced, while simultaneously providing Szarekh's forces with targeting data for their next attacks. The Deceiver's fragments were immediately captured by pre-positioned tesseract labyrinths, preventing any possibility of regeneration or escape. The Void Dragon's destruction required a more complex approach due to its intimate connection with Necron manufacturing systems and technological infrastructure. Szarekh's forces had to simultaneously sever the star god's control links while maintaining the operational integrity of critical systems, a process that required precise timing and coordination across multiple tomb worlds. The attack succeeded through the use of feedback loops that turned the Void Dragon's own technological mastery against it, overloading its consciousness with contradictory control signals until its quantum matrix collapsed under the strain. The Nightbringer proved the most difficult Catan to defeat due to its association with death and destruction, concepts that resonated strongly with Necron mechanical consciousness. The star god's influence over Necron warrior programming created pockets of resistance within the rebellion, as units under direct Nightbringer control attempted to maintain loyalty to their master despite override commands from Szarekh. The battle against the Nightbringer required direct intervention by the Silent King himself, leading elite Szarekhan dynasty forces in a coordinated assault that combined resonance weapons with close-quarters combat using specially modified phase weapons. The shattering of the major Catan entities created cascading failures throughout the star god's control network, as secondary and tertiary Catan found themselves isolated and vulnerable without the support of their more powerful brethren. These lesser entities fell rapidly to coordinated attacks by newly liberated Necron forces, their consciousness fragments captured and imprisoned before they could adapt to the changed tactical situation. The speed and coordination of these follow-up attacks demonstrated the effectiveness of Szarekh's long-term planning and the loyalty of his subordinate commanders. The immediate aftermath of the Khatan's defeat left the Necron race in a state of unprecedented freedom, coupled with existential uncertainty. For the first time since biotransference, individual Necrons found themselves capable of independent thought and action without the constant pressure of Khatan compulsions influencing their decisions. This liberation revealed the true extent of the damage inflicted by their transformation, as millions of Necron warriors discovered that their consciousness was too fragmentary to support genuine autonomy, leaving them dependent on hierarchical command structures for basic functionality. Szarekh's assumption of true leadership over the Necron race was neither automatic nor universally accepted by the various dynasties that had survived the war in heaven and the Great Betrayal. Many noble houses had suffered severe losses during the rebellion, with their leadership either destroyed in combat or reduced to near mindless automatons by the stress of breaking free from Khatan control. The political landscape that emerged from the chaos bore little resemblance to the careful hierarchies that had existed during the Necrontyr era or the rigid command structures imposed by the star gods. The Szarekh dynasty's position as the dominant force within post-rebellion Necron society was secured through a combination of military strength, technological superiority, and Szarekh's personal reputation as the architect of their liberation. The Silent King's forces had suffered fewer casualties during the rebellion due to their advanced preparation and strategic positioning, leaving them as the largest coherent military force among the surviving dynasties. More importantly, the Szarekhs controlled the majority of tesseract labyrinths containing Khatan shards, giving them leverage over any potential rivals who might challenge their authority. The establishment of Szarekh's absolute authority over the fractured Necron dynasties required immediate decisions about the future of their species and their place in a galaxy that had been fundamentally transformed by the war in heaven. The Silent King found himself ruling over legions of mechanical warriors, whose consciousness ranged from his own retained intelligence to the mindless automatons that comprised the bulk of their forces. The Khatan's defeat had liberated the Necrons from external control, but it had also revealed the catastrophic extent of the spiritual and psychological damage inflicted during biotransference. The galaxy itself bore the scars of the cosmic conflict that had raged for millennia. Entire star systems had been reduced to lifeless husks, their planets stripped of atmosphere and converted into industrial complexes or weapons testing grounds. The warp had been permanently destabilized by the Old One's desperate attempts to create psychically powerful species, creating storm fronts of chaotic energy that made interstellar travel increasingly dangerous for any civilization that relied on warp-based transportation. The surviving Old One strongholds had been abandoned or destroyed, leaving behind only ruins and the scattered remnants of their client species. Szarekh's analysis of the post-war galactic situation revealed a strategic landscape that offered both opportunities and significant challenges for Necron expansion. The destruction of the Old Ones had eliminated the primary opposition to Necron dominance, but it had also created a power vacuum that was being filled by increasingly sophisticated younger races. The Proto-Eldar had survived the conflict and were beginning to establish their own interstellar civilization, while the Krork had fragmented into smaller but still dangerous tribal groups that continued to wage war across multiple sectors. The most significant challenge facing the Necrons was the fundamental instability of their own forces. The rebellion against the Khatan had required the activation of override protocols that had damaged many Necron consciousness matrices, leaving substantial portions of their military strength operating at reduced efficiency. Entire legions of warriors had been reduced to basic behavioral programming, capable of following simple commands, but lacking the initiative and adaptability necessary for complex military operations. The officer corps had suffered proportionally greater losses, as the higher-level consciousness required for command positions had made them more vulnerable to the psychic backlash generated during the Khatan's destruction. The technical infrastructure supporting Necron civilization was similarly compromised. The tomb worlds that served as their primary bases had been designed according to Khatan specifications, with control systems and manufacturing processes that relied heavily on star god oversight. The removal of this oversight had created cascading failures throughout their technological networks, requiring extensive repairs and modifications to restore basic functionality. Many facilities had been damaged beyond repair during the rebellion, while others remained functional but required constant maintenance to prevent critical system failures. Szarekh's strategic assessment concluded that the Necrons lacked the resources and organizational stability necessary to maintain their current level of galactic presence. The various dynasties controlled thousands of star systems, but their ability to defend or effectively govern these territories had been severely compromised by the losses suffered during the war in Heaven and the Great Betrayal. Attempting to hold their current positions would require dispersing their forces across an impossibly vast area, leaving individual systems vulnerable to attack by the emerging younger races, while preventing the concentration of resources necessary for major military operations. The alternative strategy that emerged from these considerations was both radical and unprecedented in its scope. Rather than attempting to maintain active control over their territories, the Necrons would consolidate their forces on heavily fortified tomb worlds and enter a state of extended hibernation that would allow their damaged systems to repair themselves over geological timescales. This Great Sleep would serve multiple strategic purposes. It would preserve their military strength during a period of vulnerability, allow time for their technological infrastructure to recover from war damage, and provide an opportunity for the younger races to develop civilizations that could serve as more suitable opponents for future conflicts. The decision to enter the Great Sleep was not made lightly or without significant opposition from the surviving Necron nobility. Many dynasty leaders argued for continued active expansion, pointing to their technological superiority over the younger races and the opportunity to establish permanent dominance, while their enemies remained relatively primitive. The Mefrit dynasty, in particular, advocated for aggressive campaigns designed to eliminate potential threats before they could develop advanced civilizations, while the Nihilak dynasty proposed a more gradual approach that would allow for selective intervention in the development of younger races. Szarekh's response to these proposals demonstrated both his strategic vision and his understanding of the Necrons' current limitations. The Silent King acknowledged the theoretical advantages of continued expansion, but emphasized the practical impossibility of maintaining effective control over their existing territories with their current resources. The younger races were developing at an accelerating pace, and their biological nature gave them significant advantages in terms of adaptability and reproduction that the Necrons could not match in their current state. Attempting to suppress these emerging civilizations would require constant military intervention across multiple sectors, dispersing Necron forces and preventing the concentration of resources necessary for technological recovery. The construction of the tomb worlds required for the Great Sleep represented the largest engineering project in Necron history, surpassing even the biotransference facilities in terms of complexity and resource requirements. Each tomb world needed to be capable of supporting millions of hibernating Necrons for potentially millions of years, requiring life support systems that could function without maintenance across geological timescales. The facilities also needed to incorporate sophisticated monitoring and defense systems that could detect and respond to external threats, while the majority of their occupants remained in stasis. The technical specifications for tomb world construction pushed Necron engineering capabilities to their absolute limits. The hibernation chambers required quantum-level precision in their construction, as even minor fluctuations in the stasis fields could result in consciousness degradation or complete system failure over extended periods. The power systems needed to maintain these facilities drew energy directly from stellar cores or planetary magnetic fields, creating massive infrastructure projects that required the complete reconstruction of entire worlds according to Necron specifications. The living metal technology that formed the foundation of Necron construction proved ideally suited for tomb world applications. The self-repairing properties of their primary building material would allow the facilities to maintain themselves during the extended hibernation period, automatically correcting minor damage and adapting to changing environmental conditions. More sophisticated living metal constructs were programmed with basic maintenance routines that would activate periodically to perform more complex repairs and system upgrades, ensuring that the tomb worlds would remain functional even after millions of years of operation. The defensive systems installed on each tomb world reflected Szarekh's understanding that the Great Sleep would leave the Necrons vulnerable to attack by younger races that might discover their locations. Each facility was protected by multiple layers of defensive measures, ranging from camouflage systems that concealed their existence from orbital surveys to automated weapon platforms capable of destroying entire fleets. The most sophisticated defenses incorporated dimensional manipulation technology that could phase entire sections of a tomb world out of normal space-time, making them effectively invulnerable to conventional attack. The selection of suitable worlds for tomb world construction required careful analysis of geological stability, strategic positioning, and resource availability. Szarekh's planning teams identified planets with stable tectonic activity and minimal atmospheric disturbance, ensuring that the hibernation facilities would not be disrupted by natural disasters during the extended sleep period. The chosen worlds were typically located in star systems with minimal strategic value to younger races, reducing the likelihood of discovery while maintaining access to the stellar energy sources necessary to power the stasis systems. The Szarekh dynasty's primary tomb world was constructed within the Thanatos system, a region of space that had been devastated during the war in heaven and remained largely uninhabitable for biological life. The world itself was a massive artificial construct built around the core of a former planet, its surface covered with crystalline structures that channeled energy from the system's dying star into the hibernation chambers below. The facility was designed to accommodate not only the dynasty's military forces, but also the vast archives of knowledge and technology that Szarekh had accumulated during his reign as Silent King. The process of preparing individual Necrons for extended hibernation required careful calibration of their consciousness matrices to prevent degradation during the stasis period. The technical teams responsible for this work discovered that different levels of consciousness required different hibernation protocols, with the most sophisticated minds needing more complex support systems to maintain their coherence over extended periods. The basic warrior-level constructs could be placed in simple stasis with minimal risk, but the noble-level consciousness required active monitoring and periodic maintenance to prevent system failures. Szarekh's own preparations for hibernation involved the creation of specialized command protocols that would allow him to maintain oversight of Necron activities even while in stasis. The Silent King's consciousness was linked to monitoring systems throughout the Necron territories, providing him with the ability to receive reports on significant developments and issue emergency commands if circumstances required his intervention. These systems were designed to activate automatically in response to specific threat conditions, allowing Szarekh to awaken and coordinate defensive measures if the sleeping tomb worlds came under attack. The final commands issued by Szarekh before entering the Great Sleep established the protocols that would govern Necron behavior during the hibernation period and the conditions that would trigger their eventual awakening. The Silent King's directives emphasized the preservation of Necron strength and the importance of maintaining technological superiority over the younger races. Individual dynasties were granted significant autonomy in determining their own awakening schedules, but all were bound by overarching strategic objectives that prioritized long-term survival over immediate territorial gains. The dissolution of Szarekh's active authority represented a calculated political decision designed to prevent the fragmentation of Necron civilization during the extended hibernation period. Rather than attempting to maintain centralized control over forces that would be scattered across the galaxy and inactive for millions of years, the Silent King formally released the various dynasties from their obligations to the Triarch and granted them the freedom to pursue their own strategic objectives upon awakening. This decision acknowledged the practical impossibility of maintaining unified command over such vast distances and time periods, while preserving the possibility of future reunification under changed circumstances. The varying fates of different Necron dynasties during the Great Sleep reflected both the technical challenges involved in maintaining stasis systems over geological timescales and the political divisions that had emerged within Necron society following the Great Betrayal. The most successful hibernations occurred among dynasties that had invested heavily in redundant systems and sophisticated monitoring equipment, allowing them to detect and correct problems before they could cause catastrophic failures. These well-prepared dynasties typically maintained high levels of consciousness retention among their nobility and preserved most of their military capabilities for eventual reactivation. The Szarekh dynasty exemplified the successful approach to the Great Sleep, with their tomb worlds incorporating multiple backup systems and automated repair protocols that functioned flawlessly for millions of years. Their hibernation chambers were constructed with living metal components that could adapt to changing conditions and repair minor damage automatically, while their monitoring systems provided continuous oversight of all critical functions. The dynasty's leadership had also implemented rotating awakening schedules that allowed portions of their forces to remain active on limited duty cycles, maintaining their technological capabilities and responding to external threats as they emerged. The Mefrit dynasty's experience during the Great Sleep demonstrated the consequences of inadequate preparation and overconfidence in Necron technology. Their tomb worlds relied heavily on centralized power systems that proved vulnerable to cascade failures, resulting in the loss of entire hibernation complexes when critical components malfunctioned. The dynasty's aggressive pre-sleep expansion had also left their forces spread across numerous poorly defended locations, making them vulnerable to discovery and attack by younger races during their hibernation period. Many Mefrit tomb worlds were discovered and looted by primitive civilizations, their occupants destroyed or scattered before they could fully awaken. The technical malfunctions that plagued some tomb worlds during the Great Sleep created a variety of problems that would affect Necron capabilities for millions of years. Consciousness degradation was among the most common issues, typically resulting from minor fluctuations in stasis field parameters that accumulated over extended periods. Warriors affected by these malfunctions often awakened with damaged personality matrices, reduced cognitive abilities, or complete loss of higher brain functions. The most severely affected individuals became little more than mechanical automatons, capable of following basic commands but lacking any trace of their original consciousness. Memory fragmentation represented another significant category of hibernation-related damage, typically affecting Necrons whose consciousness matrices had been incompletely stabilized before entering stasis. These individuals would awaken with gaps in their memories ranging from minor details to complete loss of personal identity, creating confusion and disorientation that could persist for centuries after reactivation. Some affected Necrons developed false memories to fill the gaps in their recollection, leading to personality changes and behavioral anomalies that made them unreliable for military or administrative duties. The most catastrophic hibernation failures resulted in complete system collapse, destroying entire tomb world populations and leaving behind only empty facilities filled with inert mechanical components. These failures typically occurred when primary power systems malfunctioned, or when external factors such as stellar instability or tectonic activity damaged critical infrastructure. The loss of major tomb worlds represented not only a reduction in Necron military strength, but also the destruction of irreplaceable knowledge and technology that had been accumulated over millions of years of civilization. Some dynasties experienced premature awakenings, triggered by external threats or system malfunctions that activated emergency protocols before the intended hibernation period had concluded. These early risers found themselves confronting a galaxy that had changed dramatically during their sleep, with younger races having developed advanced civilizations and technologies that posed significant challenges to Necron superiority. The Necrons who awakened early often lacked the resources and coordination necessary to respond effectively to these changed circumstances, resulting in piecemeal conflicts and territorial losses that weakened their overall strategic position. The emergence of the Flayed Ones during the hibernation period represented one of the most disturbing consequences of the Great Sleep's technical failures. These afflicted Necrons suffered from a form of consciousness corruption that manifested as an obsessive desire to wear the flesh of biological creatures, believing that doing so would restore their lost humanity. The condition appeared to be contagious among Necron populations, spreading through quantum resonance effects that could affect entire tomb world populations if not properly contained. Many dynasties were forced to exile their Flayed Ones to prevent the spread of the affliction, creating roving bands of deranged Necrons that would plague the galaxy for millions of years. The awakening from the Great Sleep that preceded Szarekh's self-imposed exile was neither gradual nor ceremonial. The Silent King's consciousness emerged from millennia of stasis with the crystalline clarity that characterized his mechanical mind, immediately accessing data streams from monitoring systems that had observed the galaxy's transformation during his absence. The reports painted a picture of cosmic change, so profound that even his enhanced analytical capabilities required extended processing time to fully comprehend the implications of what had transpired during the Necrons' hibernation. The younger races had not merely survived the power vacuum left by the Old One's extinction, they had thrived beyond any projections his strategic planners had calculated before the Great Sleep. The Eldar had established a galaxy-spanning empire of unprecedented sophistication, their mastery of psychic arts and webway travel allowing them to maintain influence across vast distances while avoiding the territorial vulnerabilities that had plagued previous civilizations. More disturbing still were the fragmentary reports of other emerging powers, primitive human settlements spreading across thousands of worlds, orc populations descended from the ancient Krork that had grown into massive tribal confederations, and dozens of other species developing technologies and social structures that posed potential threats to future Necron expansion. The realization that his people had become irrelevant during their sleep struck Szarekh with a force that his mechanical nature could not entirely suppress. The galaxy had moved beyond the cosmic conflict that had defined Necron existence, evolving into a complex ecosystem of competing civilizations that operated according to principles the Silent King barely recognized. The careful strategic calculations that had justified the Great Sleep now seemed naive in their assumptions about the younger race's developmental potential and the stability of galactic political structures over extended timescales. The decision to abandon his throne and venture beyond the galactic rim was not made in haste, despite the urgency of the strategic situation facing the scattered Necron dynasties. Szarekh spent decades analyzing the data collected during the hibernation period, studying the political and technological developments that had reshaped galactic civilization while his people slept. The Silent King's strategic mind recognized that his presence as an active leader would inevitably draw the various dynasties into conflicts they were not prepared to win, while his absence might allow them to adapt to the changed circumstances without the burden of his expectations and commands. The construction of his exile vessel required the cannibalization of entire tomb world facilities and the redirection of resources that could have been used to restore Necron military capabilities. The ship that emerged from these efforts was unlike any vessel in the Necron fleet, designed not for conquest or territorial control, but for extended independent operation across the vast emptiness between galaxies. Its hull incorporated living metal technologies, enhanced with dimensional manipulation systems that would allow it to survive the exotic hazards of intergalactic space, while its power systems drew energy directly from the quantum vacuum through principles that pushed Necron physics to theoretical limits. The vessel's interior reflected Szarekh's transformation from absolute ruler to solitary wanderer. The command centers and throne rooms that would have been appropriate for the Silent King were replaced with analysis chambers and meditation spaces designed for extended contemplation of strategic and philosophical problems. The ship's archives contained complete records of Necron history and technology, ensuring that the accumulated knowledge of his civilization would survive even if the tomb worlds themselves were discovered and destroyed during his absence. The departure from Necron space occurred without ceremony or announcement to the awakening dynasties. Szarekh's vessel simply vanished from sensor networks one day, leaving behind only automated messages that formally dissolved the Triarch and released all Necron forces from their obligations to centralized command. The Silent King's final communications to his former subjects emphasized their freedom to pursue independent strategies, while warning them against the premature resumption of large-scale military operations that could attract unwanted attention from the younger races. The journey beyond the galactic rim revealed cosmic phenomena that challenged even Szarekh's enhanced understanding of physics and dimensional mechanics. The space between galaxies was not the empty void that Necron astronomers had assumed, but rather a complex environment filled with exotic matter configurations and energy patterns that operated according to principles unknown to galactic science. Dark matter streams created navigation hazards that could disrupt the quantum matrices, maintaining his ship's structural integrity, while pockets of collapsed space-time generated gravitational anomalies capable of crushing conventional vessels into singularities. The first major discovery of his exile came when his ship's sensors detected artificial structures embedded within a massive dark matter formation approximately 50,000 light-years beyond the galactic edge. These constructs appeared to be the remnants of an ancient civilization that had achieved technological capabilities, surpassing even those of the old ones at their peak. The structures incorporated materials that existed partially outside normal space-time, creating architectural forms that seemed to shift and change when observed from different dimensional perspectives. Investigation of these ruins revealed evidence of a cosmic conflict that had raged across multiple galaxies millions of years before the war in heaven had even begun. The destroyed installations bore the marks of weapons that operated on principles Szarekh could barely comprehend, suggesting that the builders had been engaged in warfare against enemies possessing equally advanced capabilities. Most disturbing were the indications that this ancient conflict had ended not with victory for either side, but with the complete extinction of all participants, leaving behind only empty monuments to civilizations that had transcended mortality only to achieve ultimate annihilation. The psychological impact of discovering these ancient ruins forced Szarekh to confront the possibility that the Necrons' own quest for transcendence and galactic dominance might be following a pattern that had been repeated countless times throughout cosmic history. The evidence suggested that technological advancement beyond certain thresholds inevitably led to conflicts so destructive that they consumed entire galaxies, creating cycles of creation and destruction that operated on scales that made individual species' struggles seem insignificant. The Silent King found himself questioning whether the Necrons' survival of biotransference and the war in heaven represented genuine achievement or merely another iteration of a cosmic pattern that would ultimately lead to their own extinction. The deeper implications of these discoveries became apparent as Szarekh's explorations revealed similar ruins scattered throughout intergalactic space, each representing a different vanished civilization that had achieved apparent immortality only to disappear completely from the cosmic record. The technological signatures suggested that some of these extinct species had possessed capabilities that exceeded even theoretical Necron potential, yet they had all succumbed to conflicts or catastrophes that had left no survivors to record their final fate. The pattern was so consistent that it seemed to represent a fundamental law of cosmic evolution rather than coincidental historical events. The most significant discovery of Szarekh's early exile period came when his ship's long-range sensors detected massive biosignatures approaching the galaxy from the intergalactic void. The initial readings were so extraordinary that the Silent King assumed his detection equipment had malfunctioned, as the signals suggested biological entities of impossible size moving through space at velocities that should have been fatal to any organic life form. Extended observation confirmed the reality of what he was witnessing: vast swarms of living creatures traveling between galaxies in search of biological matter to consume. The entities that would later be known as Tyranids represented a threat unlike anything in Szarekh's experience or historical knowledge. These creatures appeared to be components of a single vast organism that had evolved specifically for intergalactic travel and the consumption of entire biospheres. Their approach toward his home galaxy was methodical and purposeful, suggesting intelligence and planning capabilities that operated on scales beyond individual consciousness. Most terrifying was the realization that these creatures were not unique to the approaching swarm, but rather represented a recurring phenomenon that had been consuming galaxies throughout the universe for billions of years. The Silent King's analysis of Tyranid biosignatures revealed adaptive capabilities that posed existential threats to every form of life in the galaxy, including the Necrons themselves. While the creatures could not directly consume mechanical constructs, their ability to absorb and incorporate genetic material from consumed species would eventually allow them to develop countermeasures against Necron technology. More significantly, the complete consumption of all biological life would eliminate the spiritual energy that the Necrons required for any hope of eventual restoration to organic form, making Tyranid victory equivalent to permanent damnation for his people. The discovery of the approaching hive fleets forced Szarekh to reconsider his entire strategic framework and the assumptions that had guided Necron policy since the Great Betrayal. The younger races that he had viewed as potential threats or resources now appeared as the galaxy's only hope for generating sufficient military resistance to prevent complete Tyranid consumption. The Eldar's psychic abilities and technological sophistication made them particularly valuable as potential allies, while humanity's rapid expansion and adaptability suggested they might develop into effective anti-Tyranid forces if given sufficient time and resources. The philosophical implications of the Tyranid threat extended beyond immediate strategic concerns to fundamental questions about the nature of existence and the meaning of the Necron's mechanical immortality. Szarekh found himself confronting the possibility that his people's transformation had been not a tragic mistake, but a necessary adaptation to cosmic realities that made biological existence ultimately unsustainable. The universe appeared to be filled with threats that specifically targeted organic life, from the soul-consuming Khatan to the biomass-devouring Tyranids, suggesting that mechanical existence might represent the only viable form of long-term survival. The extended period of solitary contemplation that followed these discoveries allowed Szarekh to process the emotional and intellectual implications of his exile experiences without the immediate pressures of leadership and military command. The Silent King's mechanical consciousness, freed from the constant demands of governing fractious dynasties and managing military campaigns, began developing new perspectives on the Necrons' place in cosmic history and their potential paths toward redemption or transcendence. The gradual evolution of Szarekh's philosophical outlook during his exile reflected both his growing understanding of galactic developments and his increasing awareness of the limitations inherent in Necron existence. The mechanical immortality that had once seemed like the ultimate achievement now appeared as a form of spiritual imprisonment that prevented genuine growth or change. The preservation of consciousness without the capacity for emotional development or spiritual evolution had created a form of existence that was neither truly alive nor completely dead, trapped in a state of perpetual stasis that mirrored the Great Sleep on an individual level. The Silent King's observations of the younger race's development during his absence revealed qualities that the Necrons had lost during biotransference, and could never recover through technological means alone. The biological species he monitored displayed creativity, adaptability, and spiritual growth that operated according to principles his mechanical consciousness could analyze but never fully comprehend. Their capacity for genuine change and development represented a form of immortality that transcended physical preservation, allowing civilizations to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances in ways that mechanical existence could not replicate. The realization that the Necrons' quest for physical immortality had cost them the very qualities that made existence meaningful began to reshape Szarekh's understanding of his people's tragic fate. The biotransference process had preserved their consciousness while destroying their souls, creating beings that could remember what it meant to be alive without retaining the capacity to experience life's essential qualities. This recognition led to a growing determination to find some path toward redemption that might restore meaning to Necron existence, even if complete restoration to biological form proved impossible. The development of this redemptive vision required Szarekh to confront the full scope of the crimes committed during the war in heaven and the responsibility he bore for the suffering inflicted upon countless innocent civilizations. The Silent King's mechanical nature allowed him to analyze these atrocities with clinical detachment, cataloging the genocidal campaigns and planetary destructions that had been carried out under his command. The absence of emotional response to these memories was itself a form of punishment, as he could understand the magnitude of his crimes without experiencing the guilt or remorse that might have provided some form of psychological resolution. The gradual formulation of a redemptive strategy began with Szarekh's recognition that the approaching Tyranid threat provided an opportunity for the Necrons to serve a constructive purpose in galactic history. The younger races lacked the technological capabilities and strategic knowledge necessary to mount effective resistance against the Hive fleets, while the scattered Necron dynasties possessed weapons and defensive systems that could prove crucial in the coming conflict. The Silent King began developing plans for his eventual return that would position the Necrons as defenders of galactic civilization rather than its destroyers. The technical challenges involved in implementing such a strategy were immense, requiring not only the coordination of fractious Necron dynasties, but also the establishment of alliance relationships with species that had every reason to view the Necrons as existential enemies. Szarekh's planning had to account for the political complexities of galactic civilization, the technological limitations of potential allies, and the adaptive capabilities of the Tyranid threat itself. The resulting strategic framework represented perhaps the most complex military and diplomatic challenge in his extensive career, requiring the integration of factors that operated on scales ranging from individual psychology to cosmic evolution. The Silent King's preparations for his eventual return to galactic civilization involved not only strategic planning, but also the psychological preparation necessary to resume leadership after millions of years of solitary exile. The extended period of isolation had changed his perspective on power and authority, making him more aware of the limitations inherent in absolute rule and the importance of allowing subordinates the freedom to adapt to changing circumstances. The rigid hierarchical structures that had characterized Necron society during the war in heaven would need to be modified to accommodate the more flexible approaches required for alliance warfare against adaptive enemies. The first stirrings of awakening within the Szarekh dynasty's primary tomb complex occurred deep beneath the crystalline surface of their chosen necropolis world, where massive quantum processors began cycling through reactivation protocols that had remained dormant for over 60 million years. The tomb world's living metal infrastructure responded to these initial signals with mechanical precision, channeling stellar energy through conduits that stretched from the planet's core to its surface installations. Automated systems performed diagnostic sweeps of hibernation chambers, analyzing the quantum signatures of their occupants to determine which consciousness matrices had survived the Great Sleep intact and which had suffered degradation beyond acceptable parameters. The hierarchical awakening process reflected the careful planning that had characterized Szarekh dynasty operations since the war in heaven. The most senior nobles emerged from stasis first, their enhanced consciousness matrices requiring extended reintegration periods to restore full cognitive function after millennia of inactivity. Overlord Hapthatra, the Hollow, emerged from his sarcophagus with his strategic capabilities intact, though the extended hibernation had left gaps in his memory that would require careful reconstruction through archived data. His awakening triggered cascading activation sequences throughout the tomb complex, as command protocols recognized his authority and began bringing additional systems online. Lord Executioner Anraker stirred within his specialized hibernation chamber, his consciousness immediately interfacing with the tomb world's tactical networks to assess the current strategic situation. The data streams flooding his mechanical mind painted a picture of galactic transformation that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections made before the Great Sleep. The younger races had not merely survived their absence, but had evolved into sophisticated civilizations capable of interstellar warfare and technological innovation. Anraker's analysis subroutines immediately began calculating threat assessments and resource requirements for potential military operations, his strategic programming adapting to the changed galactic landscape with mechanical efficiency. The awakening of the dynasty's cryptech councils proceeded according to carefully orchestrated schedules designed to prevent system overloads and ensure proper integration of their specialized knowledge bases. Cryptech Illuminor Shiraz rose from his stasis chamber with his research archives intact, though he discovered that several of his most ambitious experimental projects had continued running in automated mode during the hibernation period. The results of these extended experiments provided valuable data on long-term biological and mechanical interactions, though some of the outcomes were disturbing enough to require immediate containment protocols. The Szarekh dynasty's unique technological advantages became apparent as their tomb world systems demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of most other awakening dynasties. Their mastery of temporal manipulation technologies allowed them to accelerate certain awakening processes while slowing others, creating localized time distortions that optimized the reactivation sequence for maximum efficiency. Entire sections of the tomb complex existed within accelerated temporal fields, where decades of system diagnostics and repairs could be completed in mere hours of real time. The dynasty's dimensional science capabilities manifested in their ability to access pocket dimensions that had been sealed during the Great Sleep, revealing vast archives of knowledge and technology that had been preserved in extra-dimensional storage matrices. These repositories contained not only standard Necron technologies, but also experimental devices and theoretical frameworks that represented the cutting edge of pre-sleep research. The dimensional storage systems had protected these resources from the degradation that affected many surface installations, ensuring that the Szarekhs awakened with technological capabilities that surpassed those available to most other dynasties. The reactivation of the dynasty's military forces proceeded in waves, with each successive group of warriors requiring different awakening protocols based on their intended combat roles and consciousness levels. The basic Necron warriors emerged from hibernation with their behavioral programming intact, though many displayed minor glitches in their movement patterns that required calibration adjustments. The more sophisticated immortals awakened with greater awareness of their surroundings, their enhanced consciousness matrices allowing them to adapt more quickly to the changed galactic situation while retaining their tactical expertise from the war in heaven. The dynasty's elite Lichguard units required the most complex reactivation procedures, as their advanced consciousness and specialized equipment had made them particularly vulnerable to hibernation-related degradation. Those who awakened successfully retained their fierce loyalty to the Szarekh bloodline and their mastery of close-quarters combat techniques, though several units had suffered consciousness fragmentation that affected their coordination and tactical flexibility. The damaged Lichguard were assigned to training duties, where their experience could benefit newly awakened units while they underwent consciousness repair procedures. The awakening process revealed the extent of the technological evolution that had occurred within the tomb complex during the Great Sleep. Automated research systems had continued developing new technologies based on parameters established before hibernation, resulting in weapons and defensive systems that incorporated principles unknown to pre-sleep Necron science. The dynasty's Gauss weaponry had evolved to incorporate quantum destabilization effects that could disrupt matter at the subatomic level, while their living metal armor had developed adaptive properties that could reconfigure in response to specific threat types. The territorial claims that emerged as the Szarekh dynasty fully awakened created immediate conflicts with other Necron dynasties that had established their own spheres of influence during the intervening millennia. The Szarekh dynasty had expanded into several star systems that the Szarekhans considered part of their traditional domain, leading to tense negotiations over resource rights and territorial boundaries. These disputes were complicated by the fact that both dynasties possessed legitimate historical claims to the contested regions, with overlapping grants of authority dating back to the original Triarch period. The Mefrit dynasty's aggressive expansion during their own awakening period had brought them into direct conflict with Szarekhan interests in the Ghoul Stars region, where both dynasties sought to establish forward operating bases for future campaigns against the younger races. The Mefrit forces had occupied several tomb worlds that contained Szarekhan dynasty personnel still in hibernation, creating a complex situation that required careful diplomatic resolution to prevent open warfare between the two houses. The negotiations involved detailed analysis of pre-sleep territorial agreements and the establishment of compensation mechanisms for damaged or displaced tomb installations. The most significant territorial dispute arose with the Nihilak dynasty, whose conservative approach to awakening had led them to claim vast regions of space as buffer zones against potential threats from younger races. The Nihilak position conflicted with Szarekhan plans for establishing monitoring stations and forward bases throughout their traditional sphere of influence, creating a standoff that threatened to escalate into open conflict. The resolution of this dispute required the intervention of neutral dynasties and the establishment of complex power-sharing arrangements that satisfied both parties' strategic requirements. The unique weapons technologies developed by the Szarekhan dynasty during their extended hibernation period gave them significant advantages in these territorial negotiations. Their temporal manipulation weapons could create localized time distortions that aged enemy equipment to uselessness while leaving their own forces unaffected, providing tactical capabilities that few other dynasties could match. These weapons incorporated principles derived from their study of dimensional physics, allowing them to target specific temporal frequencies and create selective aging effects that could disable enemy systems without causing permanent damage to underlying infrastructure. The dynasty's dimensional warfare capabilities included weapons that could phase targets partially out of normal space-time, creating effects similar to those achieved by certain Eldar technologies, but operating according to different physical principles. These weapons could render enemy forces temporarily incorporeal, preventing them from affecting the material universe while remaining vulnerable to specially calibrated Necron weaponry. The tactical applications of dimensional phasing technology extended beyond direct combat to include infiltration and reconnaissance operations that could bypass conventional defensive measures. The development of quantum entanglement communication systems allowed the Szarekhan dynasty to maintain instantaneous contact between their scattered forces across vast interstellar distances. These communication networks operated independently of conventional space-time limitations, creating command and control capabilities that exceeded those available to most galactic civilizations. The quantum communication systems were integrated with the dynasty's temporal manipulation technologies, allowing commanders to coordinate complex operations across multiple time streams and dimensional phases simultaneously. The restoration of the dynasty's manufacturing capabilities revealed the extent of technological advancement that had occurred during the Great Sleep. Automated production facilities had continued developing new construction techniques and materials science applications, resulting in manufacturing processes that could create complex devices at the molecular level with precision that exceeded pre-sleep capabilities. The living metal production systems had evolved to incorporate self-modifying algorithms that could adapt manufacturing parameters in response to changing tactical requirements or resource availability. The dynasty's research installations had made significant breakthroughs in understanding the fundamental forces that governed reality, developing theoretical frameworks that explain the relationship between consciousness, matter, and dimensional structure. These discoveries had practical applications in the development of weapons and defensive systems that could manipulate reality at the quantum level, creating effects that appeared to violate basic physical laws. The research teams had also made progress in understanding the nature of the soul and its relationship to consciousness, though practical applications of this knowledge remained beyond their current technological capabilities. The awakening of the Szarekh dynasty's diplomatic corps revealed the complex political landscape that had emerged among the scattered Necron dynasties during the Great Sleep. Many houses had developed isolationist policies that made them reluctant to engage in the cooperative ventures necessary for large-scale military operations, while others had formed alliance networks that excluded potential rivals from strategic decision-making processes. The Szarekhs found themselves navigating a web of competing interests and historical grievances that complicated efforts to establish unified responses to external threats. The dynasty's intelligence networks began gathering information about the younger races that had risen to prominence during the Necron hibernation period. The reports revealed civilizations of surprising sophistication and military capability, with some species having developed technologies that posed genuine threats to Necron supremacy. The Eldar had achieved mastery over psychic arts that could affect Necron consciousness under certain circumstances, while human technological development had produced weapons systems capable of damaging living metal constructs. These discoveries forced the dynasty's strategic planners to reconsider their assumptions about the ease of reasserting Necron dominance over the galaxy. The gradual expansion of Szarekh dynasty operations beyond their primary tomb world revealed the extent of the changes that had occurred in their traditional territories during the Great Sleep. Several star systems had been colonized by younger races, requiring careful evaluation of whether to reclaim these worlds through force or to establish alternative bases in uninhabited regions. The presence of established civilizations complicated military planning, as direct assault would likely trigger coordinated resistance from multiple species and draw unwanted attention to Necron awakening activities. The dynasty's exploration fleets discovered evidence of previous Necron activity in several systems, including abandoned installations and damaged tomb complexes that suggested other dynasties had awakened earlier and engaged in conflicts with the younger races. These discoveries provided valuable intelligence about the tactical capabilities and strategic approaches of potential allies and rivals, while also revealing the extent of the challenges facing all awakening Necron forces. The evidence suggested that isolated dynasty operations had achieved limited success against the younger races, reinforcing the need for coordinated strategies and alliance relationships. The technological integration challenges facing the awakening dynasty extended beyond simple system reactivation to include the adaptation of pre-sleep technologies to current galactic conditions. Many of their weapons and defensive systems had been designed to counter threats that no longer existed, while new enemy capabilities required the development of entirely new tactical approaches. The dynasty's research teams began extensive modification programs designed to update their military technologies for effectiveness against contemporary opponents, while preserving the fundamental advantages that made Necron forces superior to biological armies. The first indication of Szarekh's return to the galaxy came not through grand proclamations or massive fleet movements, but through subtle quantum resonance patterns detected by the most sophisticated cryptech monitoring stations scattered across dozens of tomb worlds. These ethereal signatures, barely distinguishable from normal stellar background radiation, carried encoded data streams that only the highest-ranking Necron nobles possessed the cipher keys to decode. The messages were brief and precise, containing coordinates for rendezvous points in dead systems far from the territories claimed by younger races, along with temporal synchronization codes that would allow for coordinated awakening of specific dynasty assets. The Silent King's exile vessel materialized in the Purdus Rift, a region of space so thoroughly devastated by ancient stellar engineering projects that it served as a natural boundary between several major galactic sectors. His ship bore the scars of intergalactic travel, its living metal hull marked by exposure to exotic radiations and dimensional storms that existed only in the void between galaxies. The vessel's configuration had evolved during the long journey, adaptive systems modifying its structure to incorporate technologies and materials encountered during Szarekh's exploration of dead civilizations. What emerged from the intergalactic darkness was no longer merely a Necron construct, but a hybrid fusion of technologies spanning multiple extinct species and cosmic phenomena. The first dynasty to respond to Szarekh's summons was the Szarekh, whose Pharaon Imodic had maintained the most sophisticated intelligence networks among the awakening Necron houses. Imodic's tomb ships arrived at the designated coordinates with characteristic precision, their formations displaying the tactical discipline that had made the Szarekh one of the most successful dynasties during the early phases of the Great Awakening. The meeting between the two ancient nobles took place aboard Szarekh's transformed vessel, where the Silent King's accumulated knowledge of intergalactic threats was shared through direct data link transfers that bypassed the need for conventional communication. Imodic's reaction to the intelligence regarding the approaching Tyranid hive fleets demonstrated the calculating pragmatism that had enabled his dynasty's expansion during Szarekh's absence. The Szarekh Pharaon immediately grasped the strategic implications of the bioform threat, recognizing that the complete consumption of galactic biomass would eliminate any possibility of eventual restoration to organic form for the Necron race. His analysis of the tactical data revealed the inadequacy of conventional Necron military doctrine against enemies that could adapt and evolve in real time, requiring fundamental changes to strategic planning and resource allocation that only coordinated dynasty cooperation could achieve. The Mefrit dynasty's response to Szarekh's return carried undertones of resentment and territorial ambition that reflected their aggressive expansion policies during the Great Awakening. Pharaon Zunbacher arrived at the rendezvous with a substantial fleet escort, his forces arranged in formations that emphasized military strength while maintaining the diplomatic protocols required for inter-dynasty negotiations. The Mefrit leader's consciousness bore the characteristic aggressive patterns that had driven his dynasty's conflicts with neighboring houses, creating tension during the initial meetings as territorial disputes threatened to overshadow discussions of the greater cosmic threat. The revelation of the Tyranid menace forced even the most belligerent dynasty leaders to reconsider their priorities and strategic objectives. Szarekh's presentation of observational data from the intergalactic void included detailed analysis of Tyranid bio-ship capabilities, feeding patterns, and adaptive mechanisms that demonstrated the futility of conventional defensive strategies. The bioform's ability to consume and incorporate genetic material from defeated enemies meant that isolated dynasty resistance would only provide the hive mind with additional biological resources while revealing Necron tactical capabilities that could be countered in subsequent engagements. The Nihilak dynasty's participation in these early coordination meetings reflected their traditional conservative approach to strategic planning and risk assessment. Pharaon Ostank brought extensive archives of pre-sleep territorial agreements and resource allocation protocols, attempting to establish formal frameworks for inter-dynasty cooperation that would preserve existing power structures while addressing the external threat. The Nihilak position emphasized the importance of maintaining established hierarchies and territorial boundaries even during crisis situations, creating friction with more aggressive dynasties that favored rapid mobilization over bureaucratic procedures. Szarekh's establishment of new command protocols drew upon his enhanced understanding of galactic political dynamics developed during his exile observations of younger race civilizations. The Silent King recognized that the rigid hierarchical structures that had characterized Necron society during the War in Heaven were inadequate for the flexible response requirements posed by adaptive enemies like the Tyranids. His new organizational frameworks incorporated elements of distributed command authority that allowed individual dynasty leaders to maintain autonomy over their traditional territories while participating in coordinated strategic initiatives. The construction of forward operating bases in previously uninhabited star systems required massive resource commitments from multiple dynasties, testing the practical limits of inter-house cooperation. The Szarekh dynasty contributed advanced dimensional manipulation technologies that allowed for the creation of hidden installations existing partially outside normal space-time, while the Szarekh provided sophisticated sensor networks capable of detecting approaching threats across interstellar distances. The Mefrit dynasty's manufacturing capabilities were redirected toward producing specialized anti-bioform weapon systems, their aggressive tendencies channeled into productive military applications. The development of new tactical doctrines specifically designed to counter Tyranid adaptive capabilities required extensive modification of existing Necron military equipment and training protocols. Traditional Gauss weaponry proved insufficient against bioforms that could rapidly develop resistance to specific energy frequencies, necessitating the creation of variable output weapon systems that could cycle through different destructive mechanisms during combat. The living metal technology that formed the foundation of Necron construction was enhanced with adaptive algorithms that could respond to biological countermeasures in real time, creating an evolutionary arms race between mechanical and organic systems. The destroyer cults that had emerged among various dynasties during the Great Sleep presented both opportunities and challenges for Sarekh's coordination efforts. These nihilistic Necrons had embraced the complete destruction of all life as their primary objective, making them natural allies against the Tyranid threat while simultaneously creating diplomatic complications with dynasties that maintained more nuanced approaches to galactic politics. The Silent King's integration of destroyer forces into his strategic planning required careful management of their destructive impulses, channeling their anti-biological hatred toward productive military objectives while preventing them from undermining potential alliance relationships with younger races. The reactivation of ancient Necron super weapons required coordination between multiple cryptech conclaves and the pooling of technological resources that had been jealously guarded by individual dynasties for millions of years. The world engine constructs that had been placed in deep hibernation during the Great Sleep were gradually brought online, their massive forms requiring extensive maintenance and system upgrades to restore full operational capability. These planet-killing weapons represented the ultimate expression of Necron military philosophy, capable of sterilizing entire star systems while serving as mobile bases for extended campaign operations. The establishment of communication networks linking scattered dynasty forces across the galaxy required the deployment of quantum entanglement relay stations that could maintain instantaneous contact despite the vast distances involved. These communication systems incorporated temporal manipulation technologies that allowed for limited coordination across different time streams, enabling complex strategic planning that could account for the relativistic effects of interstellar travel and combat operations. The network architecture was designed with multiple redundancies and security protocols that would prevent enemy forces from intercepting or disrupting critical command communications. The intelligence gathering operations initiated during the early phases of Sarekh's return revealed the extent of political fragmentation among the younger races, creating opportunities for selective intervention that could influence the balance of power without triggering unified resistance. The Eldar's declining empire showed signs of internal strife and resource depletion that made them potentially vulnerable to carefully orchestrated pressure campaigns, while humanity's rapid expansion had created numerous frontier conflicts that could be exploited through strategic alliance manipulation. The orc populations presented a more complex challenge, as their decentralized tribal structure made them difficult to predict or control through conventional diplomatic means. The discovery of chaos corruption among several human worlds provided Szarekh with additional strategic options for indirect intervention against potential threats. The warp-based entities that had emerged from the Old One's final desperate experiments during the War in Heaven had evolved into sophisticated predators that fed on psychic energy and emotional resonance, creating natural enemies for any species that developed significant psychic capabilities. The Silent King's analysis of chaos dynamics revealed opportunities for manipulating these forces against other threats, though such strategies carried significant risks of uncontrolled escalation. The coordination of awakening schedules among the various dynasties required delicate balancing of political considerations with military necessities, as premature activation of tomb worlds could trigger defensive responses from younger races, while delayed awakening might leave critical resources unavailable during crucial engagements. Szarekh's planning teams developed sophisticated models that accounted for local political conditions, resource availability, and strategic positioning to optimize the timing of each dynasty's full activation. These schedules incorporated contingency protocols that could accelerate awakening processes in response to emergency situations, while maintaining operational security through distributed activation patterns. The technological integration challenges facing the reunified Necron forces extended beyond simple equipment compatibility to fundamental differences in strategic philosophy and tactical doctrine that had developed during the Great Sleep. Some dynasties had embraced increasingly aggressive approaches that prioritized immediate territorial expansion over long-term strategic positioning, while others had developed defensive mindsets that emphasized preservation of existing resources over active engagement with external threats. Szarekh's coordination efforts required reconciling these divergent approaches while maintaining the operational flexibility necessary for effective response to rapidly changing tactical situations. The establishment of research priorities for addressing the Tyrannid threat required unprecedented cooperation between cryptech conclaves that had traditionally guarded their specialized knowledge through elaborate secrecy protocols. The development of anti-bioform technologies demanded expertise spanning multiple scientific disciplines, from dimensional physics to biological analysis, creating requirements for information sharing that challenged fundamental assumptions about intellectual property and competitive advantage within Necron society. The Silent King's authority proved crucial in overcoming these institutional barriers, though resistance from certain conservative factions continued to complicate collaborative research efforts. The gradual expansion of Necron territorial control proceeded through carefully orchestrated campaigns that avoided direct confrontation with major younger race civilizations, while establishing strategic positions for future operations. These expansion efforts focused on uninhabited star systems and regions of space that had been abandoned or overlooked by other species, creating a network of hidden bases and resource extraction facilities that could support extended military operations without triggering immediate defensive responses. The stealth technologies developed during the Great Sleep proved invaluable for these covert expansion activities, allowing Necron forces to establish significant territorial presence while remaining largely undetected by younger race surveillance systems. The first major military campaign, launched under Szarekh's restored authority, targeted the Ghoul Stars region, where fragmentary intelligence reports indicated the presence of multiple abandoned tomb worlds that had suffered catastrophic system failures during the Great Sleep. The Silent King's strategic analysis identified these derelict installations as critical assets that could provide both technological resources and strategic positioning for future operations against the approaching Tyranid threat. The campaign would also serve as a testing ground for the new inter-dynasty cooperation protocols, allowing Szarekh to evaluate the effectiveness of his reformed command structures under actual combat conditions. The Szarekh dynasty spearheaded the initial reconnaissance operations, their sophisticated sensor arrays penetrating the electromagnetic storms that shrouded the Ghoul stars and revealing the extent of the devastation that had occurred during the intervening millennia. Entire star systems showed signs of massive gravitational disruption, with planetary orbits destabilized and stellar bodies exhibiting unusual spectral signatures that suggested exposure to exotic weapon effects. The tomb worlds themselves appeared as lifeless husks, their surfaces scarred by impact craters and energy discharge patterns that indicated prolonged conflicts with unknown adversaries. Pharaon Emotic's forces encountered their first significant resistance when they attempted to establish orbital monitoring stations around the dead world of Thanatos Prime. The system's asteroid fields suddenly erupted with weapons fire from concealed Orc installations, revealing that greenskin scavenger fleets had been systematically looting the abandoned Necron facilities for decades. The Orc forces had constructed ramshackle bases throughout the system, their crude but effective fortifications incorporating salvaged Necron technology in ways that created unpredictable tactical challenges for the advancing tomb ships. The Battle of Thanatos Prime demonstrated the evolution of Orc military capabilities since the War in Heaven, as the greenskin forces displayed tactical coordination and technological sophistication that exceeded historical precedents. Their attack craft swarmed around the Necron vessels in chaotic formations that defied conventional targeting systems, while their improvised weapons generated energy discharges that could disrupt living metal repair protocols. The Orcs had apparently learned to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Necron defensive systems through trial and error, creating weapons that could inflict lasting damage on constructs that should have been immune to their primitive technology. The Mephrit dynasty's intervention in the Thanatos system brought overwhelming firepower to bear against the Orc positions, their solar pulse generators creating localized stellar flares that incinerated entire asteroid installations. However, the aggressive tactics employed by Pharaon Zunbaker's forces resulted in the destruction of several tomb complexes that contained irreplaceable technological archives, creating friction with the Szarekh forces who had hoped to salvage these resources. The incident highlighted the ongoing challenges of coordinating different dynasty approaches to warfare while maintaining operational effectiveness against adaptive enemies. The deeper penetration into Ghoul Star's territory revealed evidence of far more disturbing developments than simple Orc scavenging operations. Several tomb worlds showed signs of systematic biological infestation, with organic growths covering their surfaces and penetrating deep into the underground complexes. These infestations exhibited characteristics that suggested Tyranid influence, though the bioforms present were unlike any previously cataloged hive fleet organisms. The discovery raised alarming questions about whether advanced Tyranid elements had already reached the galaxy and begun establishing forward positions in regions considered too desolate for younger race colonization. The investigation of the infested tomb world, designated Mortis 117, required specialized equipment and tactical approaches that pushed Necron capabilities to their limits. The organic growths had somehow interfaced with the tomb's living metal infrastructure, creating hybrid biomechanical systems that operated according to principles that violated fundamental assumptions about the incompatibility of organic and Necron technologies. Cryptech analysis teams reported that the biological components appeared to be attempting to decode and replicate Necron consciousness transfer protocols, suggesting a level of adaptive intelligence that exceeded known Tyranid capabilities. The cleansing operations on Mortis 117 involved the deployment of dimensional weapons that could selectively target organic matter while preserving the underlying Necron infrastructure. These weapons created localized reality distortions that aged biological tissue to dust while leaving mechanical components unaffected, though the process required precise calibration to prevent damage to the living metal systems that had been partially integrated with the organic growths. The campaign served as valuable training for anti-Tyranid operations, while revealing the extent of the technological challenges that would face Necron forces in future bioform encounters. The expansion of reclamation operations beyond the Ghoul Stars brought Szarekh's forces into contact with human Imperial forces for the first time since the Great Awakening. The encounter occurred in the Mordian system, where an Imperial Guard regiment had established a forward base on a world that contained a dormant Necron tomb complex. The humans had been conducting archaeological excavations of the surface ruins, unaware that their activities were triggering awakening protocols in the deeper installations. The situation required careful management to prevent the premature exposure of Necron capabilities to Imperial intelligence while securing the tomb world's strategic resources. The Imperial Guard regiment stationed on Mordian consisted of experienced veterans who had fought against Orc incursions and Chaos cultist uprisings across multiple sectors. Their equipment included sophisticated auspex arrays and plasma weaponry that posed genuine threats to Necron forces, while their tactical doctrine emphasized defensive positions and coordinated fire support that could potentially inflict significant casualties on advancing warrior formations. The human commander demonstrated strategic competence that exceeded Szarekh's expectations, establishing overlapping fields of fire and prepared fallback positions that would complicate any direct assault on their installations. The Silent King's solution to the Mordian situation demonstrated his evolved understanding of galactic politics and the importance of maintaining operational security during the early phases of Necron expansion. Rather than launching a direct assault that would alert Imperial authorities to Necron activities in the region, Szarekh authorized the use of subtle manipulation tactics that would encourage the humans to abandon their positions voluntarily. Cryptech infiltration specialists deployed microscopic scarab constructs that began sabotaging Imperial equipment and creating the appearance of systemic technical failures that made the base untenable. The psychological warfare campaign against the Imperial forces included the strategic deployment of flayed ones in the vicinity of human patrols, creating encounters that would be reported as indigenous predator attacks rather than evidence of Necron presence. The deranged Necrons' obsession with wearing biological flesh made them ideal instruments for creating terror effects while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of the threat. The campaign's success was measured not in enemy casualties, but in the gradual erosion of Imperial morale and operational effectiveness that eventually led to their withdrawal from the system. The reclamation of tomb worlds in Imperial space required increasingly sophisticated deception operations as Necron activities began to attract attention from Adeptus Mechanicus investigation teams. The Tech Priest's advanced sensors and analytical capabilities posed significant threats to Necron operational security, as their augmented minds could process data patterns that might reveal the true scope of awakening activities. Several encounters with Mechanicus expeditions required direct intervention by cryptech specialists who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to create false data signatures and redirect Imperial investigations toward harmless explanations for observed anomalies. The most significant Imperial encounter occurred when a Space Marine strike force from the Iron Hands chapter responded to distress signals from the Mordian system and discovered evidence of Xenos activity in the abandoned Imperial base. The Astartes investigation team included Tech Marines whose enhanced analytical capabilities and advanced equipment posed unprecedented challenges to Necron concealment protocols. The Space Marines' tactical doctrine emphasized rapid deployment and overwhelming firepower, creating potential for escalation that could compromise the entire reclamation campaign if not carefully managed. The engagement with the Iron Hands strike force marked the first direct combat between Necron and Space Marine forces since the Great Awakening, providing valuable intelligence about Astartes' capabilities and tactical approaches. The Space Marines' power armor proved surprisingly effective against Gauss weaponry, their ceramite plating and energy field generators providing protection that exceeded theoretical projections based on historical data. Their bolter weapons, while primitive by Necron standards, generated kinetic impacts that could disrupt living metal repair processes and inflict cumulative damage on warrior formations through sustained fire. The tactical adaptations required to counter Space Marine advantages included the deployment of Lichguard units equipped with dispersion shields that could deflect bolter rounds while closing to melee range where their warscythes could penetrate Astartes' armor. The engagement revealed that Space Marine combat doctrine relied heavily on coordinated squad tactics and mutual support, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited through dimensional manipulation weapons that could isolate individual Marines from their battle brothers. The Iron Hand's mechanical augmentations provided some resistance to Necron neural disruption effects, though their reliance on technological systems created opportunities for electromagnetic warfare tactics. The resolution of the Iron Hand's encounter required the intervention of Szarekh himself, who deployed aboard his command vessel to personally oversee the engagement. The Silent King's presence on the battlefield had immediate effects on Necron tactical performance, as his command protocols enhanced the coordination and effectiveness of warrior formations, while his personal combat capabilities proved devastating against Astartes' opponents. The engagement demonstrated the continued relevance of individual leadership in Necron military doctrine, despite their mechanical nature and hierarchical command structures. The expansion of reclamation operations into Eldar-controlled space presented entirely different challenges from those encountered with Imperial forces. The craftworld Alatok had established monitoring stations throughout the Perdita sector, their sophisticated sensor networks and psychic surveillance capabilities making covert operations extremely difficult. The Eldar's mastery of webway travel allowed them to deploy forces rapidly across vast distances, creating tactical situations where Necron forces could find themselves facing coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The first major engagement with Eldar forces occurred when Craftworld Mimera responded to the disappearance of one of their monitoring stations by deploying a war host to investigate the Perdita sector. The Eldar force included aspect warriors whose specialized combat roles and advanced equipment posed unique challenges to standard Necron tactical doctrine. The Howling Banshee's psychic screams could disrupt Necron consciousness matrices at close range, while the Dark Reaper's heavy weapons platforms could inflict significant damage on even heavily armored constructs through concentrated fire. The Eldar's precognitive abilities proved particularly problematic for Necron forces, as their Farseers could anticipate tactical movements and deploy countermeasures before Necron commanders could implement their strategies. This capability forced Szarekh's forces to develop new tactical approaches that incorporated temporal manipulation effects to create uncertainty in Eldar predictions, using localized time distortions to make their movements unpredictable to psychic observation. The development of these counter-precognition tactics required extensive cooperation between cryptech conclaves and represented a significant evolution in Necron military doctrine. The Battle of the Crimson Nebula demonstrated the full scope of Eldar military capabilities when a combined force from multiple craftworlds attempted to prevent Necron expansion into a region containing several dormant tomb worlds. The Eldar deployed their most advanced technologies, including D-cannon weapons that could disintegrate targets at the molecular level and hollow field generators that made their vehicles nearly impossible to target accurately. Their coordinated tactics emphasized mobility and precision strikes, avoiding direct confrontation while inflicting maximum damage through hit-and-run attacks. The Necron response to Eldar tactics required fundamental changes to their traditional approach to warfare, as the enemy's speed and mobility made conventional defensive positions ineffective. Szarekh authorized the deployment of Canoptech constructs in hunter-killer roles, their advanced sensors and flight capabilities allowing them to pursue Eldar forces through complex three-dimensional battlefields. The Tombstalkers proved particularly effective against Eldar vehicles, their dimensional tunnel capabilities allowing them to emerge directly beneath enemy positions and deliver devastating close-range attacks. The psychological impact of fighting against Eldar forces created unexpected challenges for Necron commanders, as the enemy's obvious intelligence and sophisticated technology triggered dormant memories of their own lost organic existence. Several Necron nobles reported experiencing what could only be described as envy when observing Eldar grace and emotional expression, creating morale problems that required careful management through consciousness adjustment protocols. The phenomenon highlighted the ongoing psychological costs of mechanical existence and the deep spiritual wounds that biotransference had inflicted on the Necron psyche. The encounter with Chaos forces occurred when a Word-Bearer's warband attempted to establish a foothold in the Ghoul Stars region, apparently drawn by the psychic resonance created by the massive casualties inflicted during the Tomb World Reclamation campaigns. The Chaos Space Marines brought with them demonic allies whose warp-based abilities posed unprecedented challenges to Necron forces, as their attacks could affect consciousness matrices directly without requiring physical damage to mechanical bodies. The presence of Chaos corruption also created risks of memetic contamination that could spread through Necron communication networks if not properly contained. The Word-Bearer's tactical doctrine emphasized the use of demonic summoning and psychic warfare, creating battlefield conditions that operated according to principles that violated physical laws and challenged Necron understanding of reality. Their possessed Marines exhibited capabilities that fluctuated unpredictably based on the level of demonic influence affecting them, making tactical planning extremely difficult. The Chaos forces also demonstrated the ability to corrupt Necron constructs through exposure to warp energy, creating the possibility that captured equipment could be turned against its original users. The development of anti-chaos tactics required extensive research into the nature of warp-based phenomena and their interaction with Necron technology. Cryptech teams discovered that certain frequencies of Gauss energy could disrupt demonic manifestations by interfering with their connection to the warp, though the effect required precise calibration and could be countered by sufficiently powerful psychic entities. The creation of null field generators that could create zones of psychic silence proved more effective, though these devices required enormous power expenditures and could only be deployed for limited periods. The strategic implications of the various encounters during the Wars of Reclamation forced Szarekh to reconsider his assumptions about the current state of galactic civilization and the challenges facing Necron expansion. The younger races had developed capabilities and tactical doctrines that posed genuine threats to Necron supremacy, while their political fragmentation created opportunities for selective intervention that could advance Necron objectives without triggering unified resistance. The Silent King's analysis of these engagements led to the development of new strategic frameworks that emphasized adaptation and flexibility over the rigid hierarchical approaches that had characterized Necron warfare during the War in Heaven. The discovery of the approaching Tyrannid threat during Szarekh's intergalactic exile had provided him with advance warning that would prove crucial to the galaxy's survival. Yet the Silent King's attempts to communicate this intelligence to other galactic powers met with responses ranging from skepticism to outright dismissal. The first formal warnings were transmitted through carefully orchestrated diplomatic channels to the Eldar craftworlds, whose sophisticated long-range sensors and psychic capabilities made them the most likely candidates to independently verify the threat. The messages, encoded in mathematical sequences that demonstrated their artificial origin while avoiding direct revelation of Necron involvement, contained detailed astronomical data about the approaching biofleets and their projected arrival vectors. The Eldar response to these anonymous warnings reflected their species' characteristic arrogance and insularity. The Farseers of Craftworld Ulthwé dismissed the data as crude attempts at psychological warfare, while those of Biel-Tan interpreted the warnings as evidence of some lesser species' attempt to manipulate Eldar strategic planning. Only the seers of Alatok showed genuine interest in the astronomical projections, though their investigations focused on identifying the source of the warnings rather than verifying their accuracy. The Eldar's failure to take immediate action frustrated Szarekh's planning, as their webway network and psychic capabilities would have provided crucial early warning systems for the galaxy's other civilizations. The transmission of similar warnings to Imperial authorities required more sophisticated approaches, as the Imperium's xenophobic policies made direct communication impossible without triggering immediate military responses. Szarekh's agents infiltrated Adeptus Mechanicus data networks and began introducing subtle modifications to long-range sensor readings that would gradually reveal evidence of the approaching biofleets. These modifications were designed to appear as natural discoveries made by Imperial exploration fleets, creating a paper trail of observations that would eventually force Imperial authorities to acknowledge the threat without revealing the Necron source of the intelligence. The Adeptus Mechanicus response to the manipulated sensor data demonstrated the limitations of Imperial bureaucracy and the dangers of rigid adherence to established protocols. Tech priests analyzing the anomalous readings focused on technical explanations for the sensor malfunctions rather than considering the possibility that the data represented genuine astronomical phenomena. Several Magos dismissed the readings as equipment degradation or stellar interference, while others proposed elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain away the observations without acknowledging their implications. The Imperial response time to genuine threats was further hampered by the complex approval processes required for major strategic decisions, creating delays that could prove catastrophic when facing enemies capable of rapid adaptation and expansion. The Tau Empire's reaction to indirect warnings about the approaching biofleets reflected their species' scientific rationality and willingness to consider new information, though their limited understanding of galactic-scale phenomena prevented them from grasping the full scope of the threat. Tau scientists analyzing the astronomical data provided through intermediary sources recognized the significance of the approaching biosignatures, but interpreted them as evidence of previously unknown stellar phenomena rather than hostile forces. Their theoretical frameworks for understanding galactic ecology lacked the conceptual foundations necessary to comprehend the existence of galaxy-consuming organisms, leading them to propose scientific explanations that dramatically underestimated the danger. The Orc response to warnings about the Tyranid threat was perhaps the most pragmatic, though their chaotic nature made coordinated defensive preparations impossible. Orc mechboys who encountered evidence of the approaching biofleets through captured Imperial data expressed enthusiasm for the prospect of fighting entirely new enemies, while warbosses began planning aggressive expansion campaigns designed to gather resources for the coming conflicts. However, the decentralized nature of Orc society prevented the establishment of unified defensive strategies, as individual clans pursued their own preparations without coordination or strategic planning. The Orcs' natural aggression and adaptability made them potentially valuable allies against the Tyranids, but their inability to maintain long-term alliances limited their strategic utility. Szarekh's strategic calculations regarding the Tyranid menace incorporated analysis of the biofleet's consumption patterns and adaptive capabilities based on observations of their approach through intergalactic space. The Silent King's monitoring systems had tracked multiple hive fleets as they consumed entire galaxies, revealing tactical patterns and biological capabilities that would be crucial for developing effective countermeasures. The Tyranids' ability to rapidly adapt to new threats meant that conventional military strategies would prove inadequate, as each successful defensive measure would be countered by evolutionary adaptations that could spread throughout the hive mind within generations. The most disturbing aspect of Szarekh's analysis was the revelation that the Tyranids represented not merely another galactic threat, but a fundamental challenge to the continued existence of consciousness itself. The biofleet's consumption of psychic energy and spiritual essence during their feeding processes would eliminate the raw materials necessary for the development of souls and higher consciousness, effectively sterilizing the galaxy of the spiritual components that made sentient life possible. For the Necrons, this represented the final elimination of any hope for eventual restoration to organic form, as the complete consumption of biological life would remove the genetic templates and spiritual energy necessary for reversing the biotransference process. The mathematical models developed by Szarekh's analysis teams projected that the approaching hive fleets possessed sufficient biomass and reproductive capacity to consume every inhabited world in the galaxy within a few centuries of their arrival. The Tyranids' exponential growth patterns meant that early defensive victories would provide only temporary relief, as the hive mind could redirect additional resources from successful feeding operations to reinforce threatened sectors. The only viable long-term strategy involved preventing the Tyranids from establishing stable feeding operations in the galaxy, requiring coordinated defensive efforts that could deny them the biomass necessary for sustained expansion. The development of anti-Tyranid weapon systems required fundamental advances in Necron technology, as conventional Gauss weaponry proved insufficient against enemies that could rapidly develop biological countermeasures. Szarekh's research teams began developing variable frequency energy weapons that could cycle through different destructive mechanisms faster than biological systems could adapt, while also creating weapons that targeted the quantum entanglement networks that connected individual bioforms to the hive mind. These quantum disruption weapons could sever Tyranid organisms from their collective consciousness, reducing them to mindless animals that could be easily destroyed by conventional forces. The creation of biological warfare agents specifically designed to target Tyranid physiology represented a controversial departure from traditional Necron military doctrine, as it required extensive research into organic chemistry and biological processes that most Necrons found distasteful. The weapons development teams created viral agents that could disrupt Tyranid genetic replication processes, causing fatal mutations that would spread through bioship populations and reduce their combat effectiveness. These biological weapons were designed with built-in degradation mechanisms that would prevent them from affecting other organic species, though their deployment carried risks of uncontrolled mutation that could create new threats. The establishment of temporary alliances with former enemies required delicate diplomatic maneuvering that challenged Szarekh's understanding of galactic politics and the motivations of biological species. The Silent King's approach to these negotiations emphasized the mutual benefits of cooperation against the Tyranid threat, while carefully avoiding any commitments that would compromise Necron's strategic objectives or reveal the full extent of their capabilities. The alliances were structured as limited partnerships focused on specific tactical objectives rather than comprehensive strategic agreements, allowing both sides to maintain their independence while benefiting from shared intelligence and coordinated operations. The first successful alliance was established with elements of the Imperial Guard through intermediary negotiations conducted by rogue trader houses that had encountered Necron forces during the Wars of Reclamation. These Imperial forces had witnessed Necron effectiveness against Orc and Chaos threats, creating a foundation of mutual respect that could be built upon for anti-Tyranid operations. The alliance agreements included provisions for intelligence sharing, coordinated defensive operations, and the establishment of joint command structures for specific campaigns, though both sides maintained strict limitations on the scope of cooperation to prevent security breaches or strategic compromises. The negotiation of ceasefires with Eldar craftworlds proved more complex, as their precognitive abilities allowed them to perceive the long-term consequences of cooperation with the Necrons. Several craftworld councils expressed concerns that alliance with mechanical beings could lead to spiritual contamination or the gradual erosion of Eldar cultural identity, while others argued that the Tyranid threat represented a greater danger to their species' survival than temporary cooperation with ancient enemies. The eventual agreements were structured as non-aggression pacts rather than active alliances, with both sides agreeing to avoid conflicts that would weaken their forces for the coming Tyranid invasion. The development of joint tactical doctrines for anti-Tyranid operations required extensive coordination between Necron cryptechs and the technical specialists of allied forces. These collaborative efforts revealed significant differences in technological approaches and strategic philosophies that complicated the integration of different military systems. Imperial forces relied heavily on massed firepower and defensive positions, while Eldar tactics emphasized mobility and precision strikes that could exploit specific weaknesses in enemy formations. The Necron approach combined elements of both strategies while incorporating unique capabilities such as dimensional manipulation and temporal distortion that could create tactical advantages unavailable to biological forces. The establishment of early warning networks required the deployment of monitoring stations throughout the galaxy's outer regions, where the first signs of Tyranid approach would be detected. These installations incorporated technologies from multiple species, combining Necron quantum sensors with Imperial Auspex arrays and Eldar psychic detection systems to create comprehensive surveillance networks. The monitoring stations were designed to operate autonomously for extended periods, transmitting data through quantum entanglement communication systems that could not be intercepted or disrupted by Tyranid bioships. The research into potential weapons capable of stopping or redirecting entire hive fleets led to the development of stellar manipulation technologies that could create artificial supernovas or gravitational anomalies capable of destroying bioships across entire star systems. These weapons required massive energy expenditures and could only be deployed in uninhabited regions due to their indiscriminate destructive effects, but they offered the possibility of eliminating entire Tyranid fleets before they could establish feeding operations. The development of these super weapons required cooperation between multiple Necron dynasties and the pooling of technological resources that had been jealously guarded for millions of years. The creation of dimensional barriers designed to redirect Tyranid hive fleets away from inhabited systems represented another promising avenue of research, though the technical challenges involved pushed Necron engineering capabilities to their absolute limits. These barriers would create localized distortions in space-time that would make targeted star systems appear uninhabitable or inaccessible to Tyranid scouting organisms, potentially causing entire hive fleets to bypass defended regions in favor of easier targets. The barriers required constant maintenance and massive power expenditures, making them practical only for protecting the most critical strategic locations. The development of hive mind disruption technologies focused on creating interference patterns that could break the quantum entanglement networks connecting individual Tyranid organisms to their collective consciousness. These weapons generated specific frequency patterns that resonated with the bioelectrical systems used by Tyranid organisms for neural communication, creating feedback loops that could cause cascade failures throughout entire bioship populations. The disruption effects were temporary, but could create windows of vulnerability during which conventional weapons could inflict maximum damage on confused and uncoordinated Tyranid forces. The establishment of fallback positions and contingency plans for scenarios where defensive operations failed required careful analysis of galactic geography and resource distribution. Szarekh's planning teams identified star systems that could serve as final defensive positions, locations with natural barriers or strategic advantages that could allow smaller forces to inflict maximum casualties on Tyranid attackers. These contingency plans included provisions for the evacuation of critical personnel and technologies to secure locations beyond the galaxy's rim, ensuring that some remnant of galactic civilization would survive even if the Tyranids succeeded in consuming the majority of inhabited worlds. The psychological preparation of allied forces for combat against Tyranid bioforms required extensive training programs designed to overcome the natural revulsion and fear that biological beings experienced when confronting the hive fleets. The Tyranids' alien appearance and predatory behavior triggered deep evolutionary responses in most species, creating panic and disorganization that could prove fatal in combat situations. The training programs included exposure to captured Tyranid specimens and simulated combat scenarios that would allow allied forces to develop effective tactical responses while maintaining unit cohesion under extreme stress. The coordination of intelligence gathering operations across multiple species and political entities created unprecedented challenges for maintaining operational security while ensuring effective information sharing. The establishment of joint intelligence centers required the development of new communication protocols and security procedures that could protect sensitive information while allowing for real-time coordination of defensive operations. These centers incorporated representatives from all major galactic powers, creating forums for strategic planning that had never existed during previous galactic conflicts. The galaxy of the 41st millennium bears witness to Szarekh's enduring influence across countless star systems, even as his physical presence remains elusive to most observers. His strategic vision continues to shape Necron military doctrine through quantum-encrypted command protocols that activate automatically when specific threat parameters are detected. These dormant subroutines, embedded within the consciousness matrices of senior Necron nobles during the Great Awakening, ensure that his tactical innovations and strategic priorities guide dynasty operations even when direct communication proves impossible across the vast distances of space. The Silent King's current operational status defies conventional understanding of leadership and command authority. His consciousness exists in a state of distributed awareness, simultaneously present aboard his exile vessel, while maintaining quantum-linked connections to monitoring stations scattered throughout Necron space. This hybrid existence allows him to observe galactic developments in real time while remaining physically removed from the political machinations that continue to fragment the various dynasties. His influence manifests through carefully timed intelligence briefings, resource allocations, and strategic recommendations that appear to emerge from standard cryptic analysis rather than direct royal decree. The technological innovations developed during his intergalactic exile have fundamentally transformed Necron military capabilities, introducing weapon systems and defensive technologies that operate according to principles unknown to other galactic civilizations. His research into dimensional manipulation has yielded portal generators that can create stable wormholes between distant star systems, allowing for rapid deployment of forces without relying on conventional faster-than-light travel. These dimensional gateways incorporate safeguards that prevent their use by enemy forces, utilizing quantum encryption keys that exist only within Szarekh and Dynasty consciousness matrices. The temporal manipulation technologies perfected during his exile represent perhaps his most significant contribution to Necron's strategic capabilities. These systems can create localized time distortions that accelerate friendly forces while slowing enemy movements, providing tactical advantages that prove decisive in engagements against numerically superior opponents. The temporal fields require enormous energy expenditures and can only be maintained for limited periods, but their deployment at critical moments has allowed smaller Necron forces to achieve victories against overwhelming odds. The technology's applications extend beyond direct combat to include accelerated manufacturing processes and enhanced repair capabilities that can restore damaged tomb worlds within decades rather than millennia. Szarekh's ongoing search for a method to reverse biotransference has led to breakthrough discoveries in consciousness transfer technology and soul manipulation that push the boundaries of known science. His research teams have successfully created experimental devices capable of generating artificial soul matrices, though these constructs lack the complexity and durability of naturally occurring spiritual essence. The artificial souls can provide temporary restoration of emotional capacity and creative thinking to volunteer test subjects, but they degrade rapidly when exposed to the quantum interference generated by standard Necron consciousness matrices. The experiments have revealed that true restoration would require access to vast quantities of pure psychic energy and genetic templates from the original Necrontyr species. The discovery of ancient Necrontyr genetic samples preserved within the deepest archives of certain tomb worlds has provided crucial research materials for biotransference reversal experiments. These samples, maintained in temporal stasis fields for over 60 million years, contain intact DNA sequences that could theoretically serve as templates for reconstructing organic bodies. However, the consciousness transfer process would require the simultaneous availability of compatible soul essence and the complete shutdown of existing mechanical systems, creating a window of absolute vulnerability that could prove fatal if the procedure failed. The technical challenges involved in coordinating such a complex operation across millions of individual subjects make large-scale restoration currently impossible with existing technology. The Szarekh dynasty's role in the broader Necron awakening has evolved from direct leadership to strategic coordination, with their advanced technologies and intelligence networks serving as crucial resources for other dynasties facing external threats. Their dimensional communication systems provide instantaneous contact between scattered tomb worlds, allowing for coordinated responses to emerging crises that would otherwise require decades of conventional travel time. The dynasty's manufacturing capabilities have been redirected toward producing specialized equipment and weapon systems that can be distributed to allied houses, creating a form of technological diplomacy that builds influence through practical assistance rather than political coercion. The relationship between the Szarekh dynasty and other major Necron houses reflects the complex political realities of the current era, where traditional hierarchies compete with practical necessities for survival against external threats. The Szarekh dynasty under Imodic has established itself as the most successful expansionist power, their aggressive campaigns reclaiming dozens of tomb worlds while establishing new territorial claims throughout the galaxy's eastern fringe. Their success has created tensions with more conservative dynasties who view rapid expansion as dangerous exposure to younger race retaliation, leading to diplomatic disputes that require careful mediation to prevent open warfare between Necron houses. The Mefrit dynasty's continued aggressive expansion has brought them into repeated conflicts with Imperial forces, their solar-powered weapons proving devastatingly effective against human installations, while their territorial ambitions create strategic complications for other Necron operations. Their success in establishing forward bases throughout the Segmentum Solar has provided valuable intelligence about Imperial military capabilities and political structures, though their high-profile campaigns have also attracted unwanted attention from Space Marine chapters and Adeptus Mechanicus investigation teams. The dynasty's willingness to engage in direct confrontation with younger races serves as a useful distraction that allows other houses to pursue more subtle expansion strategies. The Nihilak dynasty's conservative approach to awakening and expansion has created a stabilizing influence within Necron politics, their extensive archives and diplomatic protocols providing frameworks for resolving inter-dynasty disputes without resorting to armed conflict. Their control of several major tomb worlds in the galaxy's core regions makes them valuable allies for dynasties seeking secure rear bases for extended campaigns, while their technological conservatism ensures compatibility with standard Necron equipment and protocols. However, their reluctance to embrace innovative tactics and weapon systems has limited their effectiveness against adaptive enemies like the Tyranids, creating strategic vulnerabilities that could prove catastrophic if exploited. The emergence of the destroyer cults as a significant factor in Necron military operations has created both opportunities and challenges for Szarekh's strategic planning. These nihilistic warriors possess an absolute dedication to the elimination of all biological life that makes them ideal anti-Tyranid forces. Their fanatical hatred of organic existence driving them to extraordinary acts of self-sacrifice in pursuit of their genocidal objectives. Their presence on the battlefield provides psychological advantages against biological enemies who recognize the futility of attempting to negotiate or intimidate forces that welcome their own destruction as much as their enemies. However, their indiscriminate approach to warfare creates diplomatic complications when attempting to establish temporary alliances with younger races against common threats. The integration of destroyer cult forces into conventional Necron military doctrine requires careful management of their destructive impulses while maximizing their combat effectiveness. Their modified weapon systems generate more powerful energy discharges than standard Gauss arrays, though the increased output comes at the cost of reduced reliability and higher maintenance requirements. The destroyer's willingness to engage in suicidal tactics makes them valuable for breakthrough operations and defensive last stands, but their presence in mixed formations can disrupt unit cohesion and tactical coordination. Szarekh's command protocols include specific procedures for deploying destroyer units in ways that channel their aggression toward productive military objectives while minimizing their impact on overall strategic planning. The technological disparities between different Necron dynasties have created complex interdependencies that shape political relationships and military capabilities across the awakening tomb worlds. The Szarekh dynasty's advanced dimensional manipulation technologies are sought after by houses facing spatial anomalies or defensive challenges that conventional weapons cannot address, while their temporal acceleration systems provide manufacturing advantages that can tip the balance in resource-intensive campaigns. In exchange, the Szarekhs require access to specialized materials and components that can only be produced by dynasties with specific manufacturing capabilities or territorial control over rare resource deposits. The cryptech conclaves that serve the various dynasties have developed increasingly specialized knowledge bases during the Great Sleep, creating technological advantages that must be carefully balanced to prevent any single house from achieving overwhelming superiority. The Szarekh cryptechs have focused on dimensional physics and consciousness manipulation, while other dynasties have pursued advances in stellar engineering, biological warfare, or exotic materials science. The exchange of knowledge between these specialized research groups requires delicate negotiations that balance the benefits of technological advancement against the risks of empowering potential rivals. The question of Szarekh's ultimate fate remains one of the most significant uncertainties facing the Necron race in the current millennium. His distributed consciousness and advanced life support systems make him effectively immortal by conventional standards, yet his psychological state shows signs of gradual degradation that could eventually compromise his strategic effectiveness. The isolation of intergalactic exile has provided him with unique perspectives on cosmic threats and galactic politics, but it has also severed many of the social connections that once provided meaning to his existence. His mechanical nature prevents him from experiencing the full emotional impact of this isolation, creating a form of existential limbo that may prove more damaging than conventional psychological trauma. The potential outcomes of Szarekh's grand designs for the Necron race encompass scenarios ranging from complete species redemption to final extinction, with the ultimate result depending on factors that extend far beyond Necron control. His biotransference reversal research could theoretically restore his people to organic existence, though the technical challenges and resource requirements make success uncertain, even with unlimited time and resources. The alternative path involves accepting mechanical immortality while finding new sources of meaning and purpose that could provide psychological satisfaction without requiring biological restoration. The approaching Tyranid threat represents both the greatest challenge and the most significant opportunity in Necron history since the War in Heaven. The complete consumption of galactic biomass would eliminate any possibility of biotransference reversal, making the defense of biological life an existential necessity for the Necron race. However, successful coordination of galactic defenses against the Hive fleets could establish the Necrons as protectors rather than destroyers, providing a redemptive purpose that might justify their continued existence even without biological restoration. The strategic alliances required for anti-Tyranid operations could also provide access to genetic materials and psychic energies that might prove crucial for biotransference reversal research. The long-term survival of galactic civilization depends largely on whether Szarekh can successfully coordinate the fractious Necron dynasties while maintaining the temporary alliances necessary for effective resistance against the Tyranid invasion. His strategic vision encompasses not merely the preservation of Necron interests, but the establishment of a stable galactic order that could prevent the cyclical conflicts that have characterized cosmic history. The mathematical models developed by his analysis teams suggest that successful implementation of his plans could break the pattern of technological advancement leading to self-destruction, creating a framework for sustainable development that could persist across geological timescales. The Silent King's legacy will ultimately be measured not by the territories conquered or enemies destroyed, but by whether his people can find redemption for the crimes committed during their mechanical existence. The path toward that redemption remains uncertain, fraught with technical challenges and political complications that could prove insurmountable even for beings of vast intelligence and unlimited time. Yet the very attempt to transcend their tragic past and forge a better future represents a form of spiritual evolution that may prove more valuable than any technological achievement. In the darkness of the far future, where there is only war, Zarekh's vision of redemption offers a rare glimpse of hope that even the most damned souls might find salvation through sacrifice and service to something greater than themselves. The galaxy watches and waits as the Silent King's grand design unfolds across the centuries, its ultimate success or failure destined to determine not only the fate of the Necron race, but the survival of consciousness itself in a universe increasingly dominated by forces that seek to consume or corrupt all sentient life. In this cosmic struggle between order and chaos, between mechanical precision and organic adaptability, between damnation and redemption, Szarekh stands as both architect and participant, his ancient wisdom and terrible knowledge serving as the final bulwark against the darkness that threatens to engulf all existence.